Fox Oakby Murder Mysteries. Book 1. Official Town Business. Chapter 1. Morning Like Any Other. Imogen jumped off her bike, letting the gizmo fall down with a loud, sad clank, and ran into Miss Rosa's bakery, making convulsive, wiggling movements with her whole body. She was not having a fit. She was trying to adjust her messenger bag. "Morning, me duck," Miss Rosa greeted her from behind the counter, and received a muffled moan from Imogen in response, who was now holding her wallet between her teeth, while rummaging in her bag in search of her mobile. "Slept in again?" Miss Rosa asked with a smile. Imogen spat out the wallet on the pristine counter. "Morning, and yes, but to my defense, I'm the only person in the town whose boss doesn't sleep. At all. I think our mayor is a vampire." Imogen repeated her usual joke. "Let me know if you ever catch him hanging from the ceiling." Miss Rosa gave her the usual response, and Imogen finally fished out her hysterically shilling mobile from the bag. Her boss's voice rushed into her ear. He had no habit of greeting her or giving any sort of preface to his requests. The cogs in her brain shifted with a mournful screech and a plea for caffeine. But while Miss Rosa was carefully putting the scones and buns into a box for Imogen, the latter was already required to understand what Mr. John Oakby, the directly elected mayor of the town of Fleckney Woulds, wanted, and where the cursed papers were. Balancing her bag, her phone, the box, and her wallet, Imogen left the bakery, still jerking her shoulder to stop the bag from sliding, while humming, confirming, and giving directions to said cursed papers. After the trouble, in his opinion, clearly worthy of the Interpol search was solved, she stared at her bike. Every bloody morning. Imogen sighed, stuffed her wallet in her bag, fixed the bag, stuffed the phone in her pocket, picked up the bike, loaded the box in the basket, climbed the bike, and pushed the pedals. Damn Dracula! Mr. John Oakby was pacing his office. Imogen squeezed in, his deadly glare brushed at her. She didn't take offense. It was clearly aimed at the person on the other end of the line, and she started organizing coffee on the side table. "Yes, sir, I understand. But as the mayor of this town—" "No, sir, I'm not a councilor. I'm the mayor. Fleckney has a directly elected mayor, and I've been holding the position for the last 3 years." "What is it?" "No, sir. We aren't hippies. It's a practice that spreads through the country more and more each day following the Local Government Act of 2000. Yes, sir, I am serious." Oakby looked at Imogen with theatrical exasperation, and she readily rolled her eyes, showing she shared his sentiment completely. The mayor pushed his hand into his hair, messing his already mussed dark curls. "No, sir, I'm not one of them from the big city. I was born and bred in Fleckney, and—" He was once again interrupted and stopped in front of the window, his unseeing eyes on the brook and green hills underneath. Whatever was said made him only more irked, and he pressed his forehead to the glass. To prevent the loud thuds of the head into the glass, which always followed next, Imogen grabbed a cup of coffee, walked up to him, and pushed it into his large, long-fingered hand. He opened his mouth to no doubt snap at the other person, but by then his favorite cheese scone was in his other hand. Imogen had moved the phone onto his shoulder, which he unconsciously pressed down with his ear, frowning and listening to the droning gentleman. The maneuver required a small hop from Imogen. The man was 6'4". Imogen gently cupped his elbow and pushed his arm up. Oakby automatically bit into the scone near his lips. Imogen smiled and went to his desk to rearrange the cursed papers that he, of course, didn't need and had pulled out of the wrong cabinet. Oakby chewed. Imogen worked. "Yes, sir. I'm aware of the election system in our country and of your position in the parish council. And yes, our towns have been wonderful neighbors for centuries." Oakby apparently had finished his scone and was heating up again. Without looking, Imogen stretched her hand and tapped his cup with her index finger. He took a sip, postponing the argument with whoever was on the other end of the line. Imogen peeked. Oakby was drinking the cream-flavored syrup he considered coffee. Imogen smirked. She'd added an extra spoonful of sugar, since Mrs. Harris, the town hall clerk, had warned her of the brewing storm. The sugar was working. Little wrinkles ran in the corners of the mayor's squinted eyes, and the corners of the lips curled up, making him look exactly like a giant purring cat. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Oakby's velvet baritone now sounded almost amicable. With her morning duties fulfilled, Imogen gave her boss a wave and left his office. Half an hour later, Imogen was industriously typing when the door to Oakby's office opened and he stuck his head out. "Imogen, do you have a boyfriend?" he asked, his eyes still on some paper he had in his hand. Mrs. Harris, who was filing the latest agriculture report into the cabinet by the wall, gasped and dropped her folder. "No, Mr. Oakby, I still don't," Imogen answered, without pausing her typing. He hummed non-committally and disappeared inside again. Imogen blindly picked up her mug and was going to drink when a loud hiss from Mrs. Harris made her jerk and almost spill her cuppa. What was this about? Mrs. Harris' pale eyes boggled behind her glasses. Imogen sighed. This would now become a major gossip. Since nothing bigger than a broken traffic light ever happened in Fleckney Woulds, she expected the mayor's sudden interest in her romantic status to become the talk of the town for at least a month. "I'm not quite sure, to be honest," Imogen answered and sipped her cuppa. "He does it sometimes, asks questions out of nowhere. It'll explain itself soon. He might need a +1 for something, or rather..." Imogen shrugged. "He just doesn't bother with explaining." Mrs. Harris eyed the door suspiciously. It was a tad too personal, wasn't it? She then looked at Imogen and greedily studied her face, clearly hoping to see Imogen flustered or hopeful. Imogen snorted a short laugh. "I don't think he knows that. I also don't think he'd be able to tell how old I am and whether I have 2 heads." Imogen threw the door an affectionate look. "He's asked me about my boyfriend about 10 times by now. He just needs it for work somehow. But then he doesn't. And he forgets." Mrs. Harris gave her a doubtful look. "He remembers the county's stats for the last 10 years, and when he was at school, he won that poetry reciting competition." The town legend about Mr. John Oakby, then of 7 years old, reciting Odyssey for 15 minutes straight, had been passed from a generation to a generation, and was told to all pupils in every school of Fleckney Woulds. Imogen, who was 10 years his younger, had heard the anecdote from 3 of her teachers, the passage by the dead-blind Greek getting longer and longer with each recollection. "He won it because he wanted the dictionaries they were giving out as prizes," Imogen reminded Mrs. Harris. "He never does anything unless he wants some practical result out of it. These days of strictly official town nature. So, I assume my non-existent boyfriend is an official matter as well." Mrs. Harris shook her head, picked up her folder, and continued her work. And then she asked, without turning, in a nonchalant voice, which Imogen quite hated but, being an unmarried 26-year-old living with a cat, heard from her fellow townsfolk ever so often. "By the way, Imogen dear, why do you not have a boyfriend?" "Because I'm married to my work, and my work, meaning Mr. Oakby, is married to his work. It's a ménage à trois, you see," Imogen answered. And Mrs. Harris blushed, clucked, and hurriedly went back to her files. Imogen, pleased with the result of her inappropriate hinting, went back to her typing. Later that day, Imogen was biking towards the mayor house when her mobile rang. Thankfully, this time she was free of her messenger bag, which she'd forgotten in her office, which was exactly the reason why she was biking back to work, in the dark, while all respectable folk of Fleckney Woulds were sitting down to dinner. She had only 2 hillocks and 1 curve to cover before she was back in the house, where the town hall and mayor residence had been located for the last 147 years. But the phone rang, and it was impossible to ignore it. Contrary to the logical approach of stopping, climbing off the bike, and getting the mobile out of her pocket, she pushed her hand into her coat without slowing down. She was hungry, The day had been long, and for certain reasons that Imogen preferred to disregard even alone with her thoughts, she didn't quite enjoy going to the Mayor House after hours. The building had been one of the oldest mills of the county, later converted into a library, a town hall, and housing for the mayor of Fleckney, meaning while Imogen were to cowardly mince through corridors to go pick up her bag, Mr. Oakby would be upstairs, in his jammies. He wouldn't be sleeping. The man seemed perpetually awake and busy, but still, he might be in jammies. An image of John Oakby out of formal clothes with his wide shoulders, surprisingly athletic for a pencil-pusher torso, long legs, and all the rest of his glorious, mouth-watering, large and warm self, which Imogen under no circumstances had even noticed. Thank you very much. Let's say Imogen would sleep much better if she maintained that carefully built distance between her work and her libidinous fantasies. She pulled at the mobile. The bike veered, and here she was in a ditch, both her knees in burning pain and her phone sadly glowing in the greenish swamp water. To make matters 100 times worse, before the mobile died with a last forlorn glimmer, she'd noticed the number. Imogen made the best choice in the worst situation. She left the bike behind and ran, one hillock, another, sharp curve, and she tumbled into the parlor of the Mayor House. All her habdabs forgotten, she rushed through the corridors, quite certain that even if she were to encounter her boss in his pants, she wouldn't care. She quickly unlocked her office, grabbed the phone, and drummed her fingers on the keys. "It took you a while, Mops." Her sister's tone was mocking. "And now you're ringing from your work phone. Were you knobbing your Delish boss on his desk?" "What's wrong, Rosie?" Imogen asked, still out of her breath after the energetic jog. "Well, I'm not going to get home tonight, and I was wondering if you'd look after the Spragues." "Rosie," Imogen groaned and dropped her head on the desk. She now could distinguish the noise of a party in the background, and then she recognized the voices of a couple of the blokes from the factory Rosie worked at, all now sounding quite Larry. "Rosie, you need to go home," she said without any hope in her voice. "Blimey, Mops, don't be so nasty. You have nothing to do. It's not like you have a fellow waiting for you to warm up your slippers." Obnoxious laughter rolled in the background on the other end of the line, and Rosie sniggered. "Yeah, and you need to pick up some food on the way. The fridge is empty." Imogen opened her mouth to finally firmly tell her sister to take care of her family herself, but Rosie had already hung up. Imogen sat at her desk for a few seconds, trying to take her breathing under control, and then she straightened up and turned on the table lamp. Her favorite work trousers were torn on both knees, and she could see blood and dirt in her naked skin. There was water in one of her shoes, and her coat was soaked on her left side. And then she remembered who lived upstairs, and how she would absolutely die of shame if he saw her in this state. And she quickly turned off the light and jumped to her feet. The knees hurt, and her eyes started to sting from how sad, wet, miserable, and truly pathetic she was. And the chandelier lit up, and she met the eyes of the last person she'd like to see at the moment. Chapter 2. Scrapes and Cogs. "Mops, is that you?" Sergeant Andrew Cooper stood in the doorframe, his hand on his armpit holster, or whatever those were called. It did make him look quite dashing, and even taller and more broad-shouldered. "Evening, Andrew," Imogen muttered, slowly edging from behind the desk. There was no point in hiding. Andrew always noticed everything. "What happened to your legs, Mops?" he exclaimed, and made a few long strides towards her. "Did you fall off the bike again?" "It only happened once before," Imogen mumbled and stared at the top of his blonde, curly head. He squatted in front of her and stretched his hand. "May I?" he asked, and looked up at her. Imogen smiled into the familiar green eyes. "We should go outside. We'll bother the mayor," she whispered. "Maybe we should," Andrew said in a pointed tone, but kept his voice down. "He surely has the first aid kit here." "We have one in the office bathroom, but I'd rather we went to your car." Andrew got up and nodded. "Let's go, Mops." Imogen readily looped her arm through his, and they walked out, turning off the light and locking the door behind them. Imogen climbed into the back seat of his police car and sat waiting for him to get the kit. "What are you doing here anyway?" she asked, and his head popped up from behind the door of the boot. "I was on my way home when they told me Mrs. Carter from the cottage across the hill saw the lights in the town hall offices. She, of course, rang us up. She was worried it's them gypsies," Andrew drew out in a funny, high-pitched voice. "And you got wrangled into checking it out? Poor Andrew," Imogen laughed. He walked around the car and turned on the light on the ceiling. "Well, I suppose a girl with smashed knees is a better catch than a band of vagabonds," Andrew answered, giving her an impish grin. He then opened some bottles and a package of gauzes. "Are we ripping your trousers then?" "I suppose." Imogen threw a doubtful look at the shreds of fabric. "I can always cut them and turn them into shorts." Andrew pulled out scissors from the kit and started carefully cutting. The knees were in a worse shape than Imogen assumed, and she sighed. The next day would be a blast. "Andrew, don't think me ungrateful or anything, but could we chivvy a tad, please? I need to go as soon as possible." "Oh?" Andrew was now cleaning the bruises, and Imogen hissed and squeezed her eyes. "Do you have a date?" he asked, and blew gently on her bruises. "Ha ha," Imogen deadpanned. "What do you mean, a date? Haven't you heard? I'm the mayor's mistress." Andrew's hands froze, and he slowly lifted his face. Imogen couldn't see the expression very well, since he was blocking the light from the ceiling. "I'm joking, you clot." Imogen sighed again. "And no date. I need to go to Rosie's." Andrew went back to his work. "Is she out again?" His tone was nonchalant. "Yeah, and I need to stop to get some food. Mr. Clark's convenience should still be open." Imogen looked at her watch. Andrew was carefully putting plasters on her knee. "I can just see the suppressed judgment bubbling in your skull, Andrew," Imogen grumbled, and he patted the ends of a plaster with the tips of his fingers. "You know what I think, Mops. She's taking advantage of you, and you're too nice to stop her." "I'm all those two children have, Andrew," she said softly, and he looked up at her, his eyebrows raised in his habitual concerned expression. "I still think you should report her." "And risk giving up Kathy and Brian to the system?" "No, Andrew." He opened his mouth, and she hushed him. "A bad mother is better than none. We both know that, don't we, Andrew?" He gave her a joyless smile. "We do." He backed off out of the car and straightened up. "All right, Mops, let me help you to the front seat. I'll drive you to the shop and then to the estates. I'm sorry I can't stay for much longer. I have an early inquiry tomorrow." "You've already done so much." Imogen let him pull her out by her hand. For a second, she was standing very close to him, his soft green jumper in the open leather jacket right in front of her nose. "Thank you." A thought, which had been quite a habit of Imogen's, to be frank, came. It would have been so much easier to be in love with Andrew as opposed to not being in love with anyone. Imogen no less habitually veered away from the thought of another male in her life. Andrew was, as every female in Fleckney Woulds who possessed a pair of eyes, at least one brain cell and a pulse, would say, too good to be true. He was decent, kind, and handsome, a policeman with an impeccable record. He sang in 2 church choirs. He played cricket. He was polite to the extreme, and single. There had been a talk about him and Annabelle Craig for a while, but judging by her sour look, the rumors remained just that. He also had a few merits as if made bespoke to Imogen's purely theoretical personal preferences. He had wonderful high cheekbones, beautiful hands, and most importantly, he was grand with her niece and nephew. And yet, nothing stirred. Imogen had quite accepted that her personal life would always consist of an unrequited longing for an unattainable male with a strong will, long legs, and thoughtful eyes. Except, why did it have to be not Andrew? It would have been so easy to pine over him. She saw him occasionally. They'd gone to theater couple times together. He'd driven her and the kids to the Fete for several years straight. And still, that was all that Andrew was. A childhood friend and a very attractive man, but in a sort of abstract way. Even the well-defined chest under the cashmere jumper and the pleasant fresh smell of his aftershave didn't entice Imogen to press her nose to the aforementioned chest, while the thought of doing it with another man would come to Imogen 25 times in 8 hours at least. Once she was settled, Andrew took the driver's seat. "How are you going to get to work tomorrow, Mops?" he asked, starting the car. "I'll have to call a cab, I suppose," Imogen answered, already calculating the size of a hole this little indulgence would make in her budget, which was already very much similar to a slice of Swiss cheese, a very thin slice. And Imogen sighed. "You really should get a license, Imogen. I told you, you can have my dad's old car." "Uh-huh," Imogen answered absent-mindedly, lost in the sad thoughts about those 2 volumes of Dorothy Sayre she had put aside in Ms. Sanders' bookshop. They would have to wait for another couple months now. "And who will teach me to drive, Andrew? A school certainly won't manage. You know I'm physically incapable of operating anything mechanical." "Oh, not the old tale of Imogen versus technology again," Andrew laughed. "Not technology, Andrew. I'm wicked with a computer, and even our printer listens to me," Imogen exclaimed defensively. "It's the mechanical part, cogs and levers. I broke my toaster again last week." Andrew laughed louder. "Oh, do shut up, Andrew. It's true. It now goes ding, but the toast stays in and burns." "Do you want me to have a look at it?" Andrew offered, and Imogen gave him the usual, "Thank you, but it's okay." Maybe if it were made by Apple and had Wi-Fi. Andrew drew out and Imogen snorted. Maybe then it'd stop filling my kitchen with smoke. "I still think you should try. I did teach you to ride a bike." He gave her a cheeky side glance. "And look where it got me." "Into a ditch?" Andrew asked, and they both laughed. They stopped at the shop, and Imogen picked up some bangers, pasta, a bit of fruit and vegetables, milk, and a couple more things. "Going to your sister's, Imogen, dear?" Mrs. Clark asked, bagging Imogen's purchases. Imogen sighed. The old part of Fleckney Woulds, where the shop, Imogen's cottage, and the Mayer house were, was the neighborhood Imogen grew up in. And of course, everyone knew everything. At least since Rosie had moved out from their family home to the estate, less was known about her lifestyle. On the other hand, everyone who knew Rosie when she was a child, and especially a teen, could make an educated guess. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Clark." Imogen gave the woman a tense smile, and then couldn't help but execute a small revenge. "How is your book going?" Mrs. Clark had been writing romance novels for quite a while now, but had no luck publishing them. She'd given Imogen a draft to read once. It was dreadful. As inexperienced as Imogen was, she was quite sure that the disturbingly detailed descriptions of poses and actions Mrs. Clark had provided in her book were not actually physically possible to execute. "Quite well," Mrs. Clark answered in a brittle voice, and shoved the bags towards Imogen. Andrew picked them up, futilely trying to hide a chuckle under a coughing fit. "Are you sure you don't need me to go up with you?" Andrew asked, but Imogen was already climbing out of the car. No, I'll be all right, and thank you." Imogen took the bags from the back seat and then stopped near the passenger door window, which he'd lowered thoughtfully. "I mean it. Thank you, Andrew." He gave her a long look, which she couldn't quite decipher, and then nodded. "Good night, Mops." "Night." She knew he'd wait till she entered the building, so she gave his a clumsy wave with her occupied right hand and walked towards the entrance. The lift wasn't working again, and she sighed and ventured into her climb. The knees hurt, and she was thinking she should have changed, really. There was no need to frighten the children with her bloodied clothes, but she'd felt she had burdened Andrew already, and asking him for yet another stop would be just too much. She unlocked the door and slowly walked into the flat. It was dark, and she threw a quick look at her swatch. It was 8:30, so the children weren't supposed to be asleep. "Kathy! Brian! It's me! Are you here?" she called, and the light went on in the lounge, and 2 disheveled heads stuck in the doorway. "Aunt Imogen!" Kathy shouted, and both children beamed with smiles. "It's you! Imogen!" Brian hollered and rushed to her. Imogen had just a second to put her bags down before both children were pressed into her. Their angular limbs were inflicting quite a lot of pain upon her battered self, but at least they weren't bothered by her unorthodox looks. "Of course it's me. Who did you expect?" Imogen ruffled two sandy blonde heads. The children were quite smelly, actually. Imogen's mind was already working on the dinner and baths schedule. "Tommy Gertie picked Mom up earlier," Kathy whispered into Imogen's side. "He was with friends, and they were already drunk." Imogen cringed, so the children were hiding in the lounge, with lights off, worried Rosie wouldn't be alone when she came home. "All right, my lambkins, let's go eat something. I'm starving. I haven't eaten anything all day," Imogen said in a pretense jolly voice, "and I will tell you how clumsy your aunt is." The children cheered. Kathy grabbed one of the bags, while Brian was already running to the kitchen to start the water for tea. "Did you fall, Aunt Imogen?" Kathy asked over her shoulder, hauling the groceries in her stick-like arms. "Yes, spectacularly, into a ditch, and my phone drowned." Imogen mimicked gasping for air and made bubbling noises. Brian, who was now running around her like a puppy, giggled. "And then Andrew came and saved me," Imogen announced dramatically. "Do you remember Andrew?" Imogen started putting groceries on the table. "He's a policeman," Brian answered excitedly. "He's beautiful," Kathy added in a dreamy voice. Imogen laughed. Yes. And you know what? He thought I was a burglar and came with a gun to stop me," Imogen said theatrically. The children boggled their eyes at her. "But then he saw it was me and drove me here," Imogen added. "You should marry him," Kathy said decisively, and Imogen snorted. "I can't. I'm waiting for Prince Harry to propose." The children exchanged confused looks. Imogen, meanwhile, opened one of the bags and gave the eggs inside an appreciative look. "All right, let's deal with the important matters. Marriage is such a nonsense any road. Where's your pan, Kathy?" Chapter 3. Late to the Party. The bus was late. Imogen had taken a cab to her place from Rosie's. She needed clean clothes and fresh bandages, and couldn't afford the expenses of another trip. So she was now standing on the stop, nervously checking her watch and cursing under her breath. "He's flirting with the coffee girl again, down at the station. Mark my words," an elderly gentleman on the bench near her grumbled. Imogen thought his name was Spencer, or Spence. They had taken the bus together for 2 years now, and she could vaguely remember filing an official complaint of his at the office. It had to do with smoking, and not buses, though. Imogen sighed. She was now late for work and had no means to let her boss know, since her phone was impersonating Titanic at the bottom of a ditch. "You're the mayor's girl, aren't you?" Mr. Spencer or Spence asked, and Imogen tensed. The eyes of everyone on the stop were predictably on her now. "What's he going to do about them geese, then?" the man asked, squinting intently at her. Imogen sighed. She then plastered a polite smile on her face and turned to Mr. S. "I'm sorry, what geese?" "The geese from the Mallows farm. They wander on the northern road, you know. Someone might get killed on that curve." Mr. S. pointed his bony, crooked finger at Imogen. "He's right, you know," some middle-aged woman chimed in and shook the leek bunch she was holding. Imogen edged away from it. "That curve is a death trap. First Peters, then Jones Smith. Who's next to die there?" the woman asked in a tragic tone. "Leave the poor child alone." An old lady sitting on the bench interfered and gave Imogen a comforting smile. "Firstly, Peters and Smith died there 12 and 7 years ago, respectively," the lady continued, "and Peters was drunk out of his mind, while Smith was run over by a lorry from another county. And even if the curve is dangerous, what is this child supposed to do about it?" "Let the mayor know people are worried." Several voices joined in. "Mr. Oakby is aware of the state of the northern road," Imogen answered levelly. It's in the reconstruction plan for May." "Oh, well then." Mr. S. huffed couple times, but since he had been the most active out of the spontaneous protesters, the conversation then died out. Imogen exhaled discreetly. The bus finally arrived, and everyone climbed in. Imogen was getting off at her stop when the old lady who'd supported her caught her sleeve. "But my dear, you do need to grow out your hair," she said in a soft, reproachful tone. "I understand it's of the unfortunate color, but he will not notice you with this army haircut of yours." She pointed at Imogen's pixie hair with her eyes. Imogen's hand unconsciously flew to the short curls at the back of her head. "Who he?" she asked the lady in a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, Mr. Oakby, of course. Such a dashing gentleman despite that dreadful beard of his." Imogen laughed and patted the woman's hand on her sleeve. "He wouldn't notice me even if I grew a beard," she answered, twisted out of the surprisingly tight grip of the little wrinkly hand, and tumbled out of the bus. Imogen opened the door to her office and stopped in her tracks, her jaw descending to the floor. Everything in the small room seemed to fly around and smoke and spit out sparks. The electric kettle, the coffee machine, Mrs. Harris, and the mayor. "Imogen, where have you been?" Mrs. Harris hollered and flailed her arms, splashing the coffee out of the pot she had in her hand. The mayor, meanwhile, pulled the cord out of the kettle, which indeed was smoking and not steaming as it was supposed to. "The Americans!" he barked at Imogen and grabbed the kettle. At that moment, the printer spat out 3 sheets, 2 of which were crinkled. "The Americans!" he repeated, pointing at the papers with the kettle. The water predictably flew, rendering the printer inoperative. It beeped mournfully and jammed the next sheet. "And she's dead!" Mrs. Harris joined the Greek tragedy-style chorus of the roaring mayor and hysterical beeping of various devices. "Could you believe it? Killed at the Northern Road, on the Mallow Curve." "By geese?" Imogen blurted out. This made Mrs. Harris and the mayor, who was jerking the paper out of the printer with his left hand while sloshing the boiling water from the kettle in his right over Imogen's desk and telephone now, freeze and gape at her. Imogen sighed and got to work. She pulled the beverage containers out of the hands of the town administration and stuffed the pot and the kettle on the windowsill. She then turned off and turned on the printer that happily greeted its true master with a blink of a green eye and started printing, buzzing busily. She pulled out the cord from the coffee machine that was still producing the beverage onto its empty bottom, making the evaporating drink hiss and steam. "Mrs. Harris, we will need more coffee and more tea, please. Would you be so kind as to pop across the road to the tea shop? Some pastries would be great, too." Imogen then leaned to the older woman and whispered loudly, "We need sugar to keep his temper in check. Tell me all about the death when he's busy." She theatrically pointed at the mayor with her eyes, rightfully assuming that he wouldn't hear or notice anything, since he was already absorbed into reading the still warm papers from the printer. Mrs. Harris gave Imogen a conspiratorial nod and pranced away. Imogen grabbed the mayor's upper arms from behind and started softly pushing him towards his office, maneuvering him between the furniture. "So, what is it about the Americans?" she asked, and deposited him in his chair. He handed her page 1 and 2 while reading number 4. "It's that motorway contract the county is pushing on us." He vaguely gestured towards the papers in her hand, and Imogen skimmed through them. "The one to go through the Mears," he continued. "The councilors and magistrates all voted aye." He then handed her the last pages. Even without number 3, Imogen could grasp the gist of the letter from the county council. After all, the idea to allow an American construction corporation to build a tarmac near the western border of Fleckney Woulds had been discussed and rediscussed for the last year. The mayor had been resistant, and Imogen loved him for it only more. Not loved, respected and appreciated, she would correct herself. The latest proposal was even more detailed and sounded even more enticing than the previous ones. More locals were promised jobs, and the Americans were now offering an even shorter period of works, and alluded to more subsidies from the Government Department of Highways. Imogen lifted her eyes from the papers and saw that the mayor had dropped his head at the back of his tall chair and was staring at the ceiling, frowning. Imogen habitually appreciated his masculine jawline under the thick, dark beard and his strong neck. It had become a sort of a background activity now, in no way interfering with her primary work functions. "What do you think about it, Imogen?" he suddenly asked, and Imogen tilted her head. "Me?" He straightened up and looked at her, his mesmerizingly bright blue eyes focused on her. Imogen gulped. "Yes, you." He was calmly waiting for her answer, and she cleared her throat. "Well, on paper it sounds very good," she drew out cautiously. "But," he encouraged, "but when was building a tarmac through a historical village ever good business?" She drew out, and he nodded and drummed his fingers on the armrest. "Exactly. And again, those mirrors. That's where those footpaths are? The dwellers' rooms, isn't it what they're called? My grandmother used to walk them with me when I was little." Imogen pushed the thought of a little John Oakby, dark curls, chubby cheeks, blue eyes, at the back of her mind, and stepped closer to his table. "They are not what they used to be now. I took my children there last year, and it's just all rubbish and vandalized benches there now." Imogen had read many times about a person's pupils dilating or their eyes widening, but she had never observed it in reality before. And yet, here was the mayor, staring at her flabbergasted. "You have children?" he rasped out. "Oh, I meant my nephew and niece, my sister's kids." "Oh." The mayor blinked a couple times and seemed to be getting over his shock now. "Right. You were saying?" "Well, before those were meres, right? And there are a few old cottages there, the U Cottage and a few others. But then the town grew, and it's sort of hugging the meres on the north." Imogen mimicked something vaguely round in the air with her splayed fingers, and the mayor followed the gesture with his eyes. "And it's not much left there," she said, "and teens go there for, you know." The thick black eyebrows slowly rose questioningly, and Imogen blushed. "For what?" "Parties?" Imogen said in a squeaky voice, and one of the eyebrows stopped, while the other one continued its journey. "Didn't you go when you were young?" Imogen blurted out, and then choked on her words, mortified by the realization of what exactly she'd just said. Some new expression danced in the mayor's eyes. Imogen couldn't quite place it, but she seemed to see a tiny smile in the corners of his lips. "No, Imogen. In the olden days, when I was young and not as decrepit, I spent my evenings in the library." "Right," Imogen whispered, her cheeks flaming painfully. "Of course, your law degree and preparing for the bar and so on." "Indeed." He was still eyeing her with the same odd twinkle in his eyes, and Imogen considered a hasty and embarrassing retreat, but he took pity of her. "So, you're saying there isn't much there to preserve? Didn't you hand me over 5 petitions from concerned citizens just last month regarding the heritage footpaths and something about the red benches?" "The scarlet benches, sir," Imogen corrected him, regaining her footing. "Regency era, wrought iron, made circa 1830s, donated to the town by Mr. Patrick Fitzroy, the grandfather of the current Mr. Fitzroy, in 1960-something, traditionally painted scarlet red upon the request of his batty wife. She was a ginger," Imogen added, and the mayor threw Imogen's own carrot-colored head a look. "But you see they aren't looking this good these days," Imogen said, and wrinkled her nose, "especially after the invention of Sharpie markers." "You have an excellent memory, Imogen," the mayor pronounced slowly, once again giving Imogen a lingering, studying glance, which she, once again, didn't understand. "Thank you, sir," she muttered. "All right. Get me all the information on the footpaths, the benches, and the mirrors, and tomorrow you and I are going to visit the place and see for ourselves." Imogen nodded and was ready to leave when he asked, "2 more questions. How many of those bloody benches are there, Imogen? 4, sir. Good Lord, 4 benches and so much headache, he mumbled and pinched the bridge of his nose. He then looked up at her. That would be all, Imogen. You said 2 questions, sir. Ah, yes. He gave out a fake little cough, and Imogen wondered what could have made him squirm on his chair in an obvious discomfort. Do you know anything about Mrs. Patricia Fitzroy? The current Mr. Fitzroy's daughter-in-law? Imogen did know quite a bit, but not all of it she was willing to share with the mayor. She's a school teacher in Fleckney Woulds Comprehensive. My niece goes there. Mrs. Fitzroy teaches arts. Married into money, then? He asked pensively. Well, the Fitzroys have 5,000 acres and the Holly Branch mansion in the center of it. Mrs. Fitzroy's father was a butcher and a drunk. She has his temper and his habits. Imogen breathed out and then bit into her bottom lip in embarrassment. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. But she is so very horrible, Imogen exclaimed, losing her composure again, and the mayor tilted his head inquisitively. She simply tortures those children, Imogen exclaimed. She has no talent of her own, and she tramples over anyone who shows any potential, and she hates the job. I don't understand why she wouldn't just quit and enjoy some of more appropriate pursuits, like furniture collecting or bridge. She died in a car accident this morning, the mayor said calmly, and Imogen gasped and pressed her hands over the mouth. But don't feel bad, he said calmly. I have a feeling what you've just said will be the most polite and kindest of what will be now discussed about her. Imogen's lips trembled. A bully or not, the woman's dead. My sister is the headmistress of the school, the mayor suddenly announced. Imogen was aware. There will be inquiries. The Fitzroys are the pillars of the community after all, he drew out. Was it on the Mallow curve? Imogen asked, remembering Mrs. Harris's frantic clucking. Yes, and it's due repairs in May, right? Get me all the information about it as well, please. And a coffee. Imogen promised him both and went into her office. She needed to make a few calls in private. Chapter 4. Grass and Pantry. Imogen agreed to join Mrs. Harris for lunch. Normally, Imogen would politely refuse such offer from the woman, not that Imogen had been invited often. Mrs. Harris was constantly on some complicated diets, and her choices of places to eat terrified Imogen. Mrs. Harris was also just a tad too nosy, but today Mrs. Harris was dying to share information, and not fish for one, while Imogen was inclined to listen. She was driving that preposterous white car of hers. Mrs. Harris started her report as soon as the entrance door of the Mayor house closed behind them. Who'd heard of a snow-white car? Did you know she had everything either in white or black? Except that appalling red lipstick she wore. I told my sister many times, not with this skin tone, she shouldn't. It made her look so sickly. Mrs. Harris unlocked her car and Imogen climbed in. And I'm sure the town hall will hear no end of it, how the road was unsafe and how the fence of the Mallow farm had broken down. But she drove like a maniac, Mrs. Harris continued, showing not much more moderation in her own driving. Imogen sank her nails into the door handle. Have I told you she once almost ran me over? Mrs. Harris scoffed. On the Daisy Lane I was coming out of the bookshop, the one that belongs to poor Mrs. Sanders, and she just jumped from around the corner, in a residential area. Mrs. Harris floored her accelerator, and Imogen thought that perhaps whatever knowledge Mrs. Harris had was not worth losing one's life over. There will be no peace now. Mrs. Harris mournfully shook her head, and Imogen suppressed a squeaky plea to the woman to keep her eyes on the road. With her husband being this big businessman, all that money, and her father-in-law with all his ancestors and the family crest and owing half the town, the woman sighed. If only it could somehow be proven that it was her fault and not the road. They finally arrived at a cafe, and Imogen threw a sad look at the picture of a moronically smiling carrot, hugging a beetroot on the window. Bunny food again, Imogen thought in dread. And she was right. Welcome to Raw Energy Cafe. A person of indistinguishable gender and age, and clearly unaware of the existence of combs or razors, greeted them, and they were seated. Imogen looked into the menu on the wall, decorated with a drawing of a smirking broccoli, and wistfully thought of the wonderfully aromatic box a delivery boy had carried by her when she was picking up her coat to go out of the office. It said, Willie's Fish and Chips, Aussie on it, and Imogen could bet its contents were now in the mayor's stomach, making him very content and warm. Imogen doubted a kale salad with pine nuts and raspberry vinegar, no oil, was going to have the same effect on her. I just can imagine how relieved the pupils will be. Mrs. Harris took a sip of her carrot juice. She treated them most poorly, and her colleagues as well. She thought she was invincible, hiding behind her husband and his family. Missed classes, and almost every Friday, mind you. Trips to some beaches in the middle of a term, and then she'd come back, tanned and with new diamond earrings. Much good they will do now. Imogen cringed from the venom in the woman's voice. Imogen liked gossip. She knew that much about herself, and that's why she always tried to stay away from situations which would give her a chance to tell or listen to any. She had initiated this dirty laundry washing session herself, but she wasn't enjoying it a bit. There was just too much malice in Mrs. Harris's words for Imogen to ignore. I agree with you, she had been unfair to her students sometimes, but no one deserves such death, or any death for that matter. Imogen gave Mrs. Harris a firm stare, and the woman pressed her head into her shoulders. Ordering, Imogen had poked into the menu randomly and was now waiting for her carrot patties with soy sour cream. Mrs. Harris sat in silence, pouting. The silence lasted for only a few minutes, since the event had been just too extraordinary. Nothing remotely interesting ever happened in Fleckney Woulds to be contained within Mrs. Harris's mind without bursting out in the verbal form. All three of my nephews were in one of Mrs. Fitzroy's classes. Is your niece? The woman asked Imogen in a nonchalant tone, testing the waters. Yes, Kathy takes drawing with her. Imogen stabbed the sad orange puck, trying to chase away certain unpleasant memories from her own school years. My nephews had quite little success in her classroom, but again, all they care about is footy. Mrs. Harris stuffed her cheeks with something green and crunched loudly. They have mentioned her preposterous outfits, though, always black and white and, well, skin tight. She had a wonderful figure, Imogen stated firmly. Not only she wanted to prevent any further of the unpleasantries Mrs. Harris was obviously planning to spit out, it had also been true. Mrs. Patricia Fitzroy had been small, fit, and exactly the perfect balance between lithe and curvy. Imogen, with her skinny pins, angular elbows, and non-existent cleavage, had been envious. Not jealous, envious. She could appreciate other women's beauty without wishing to look like them or for them to lose their attractiveness. She just sometimes wished she had a bit more in the bosom and the bottom. Mrs. Harris speared a sad-looking, oilless leaf on her plate and sent it to her mouth. I bet she had surgeries, all those trips to Switzerland to those alleged ski resorts, she scoffed. I bet it was all for those liposuctions to get rid of all the fat. I think my lunch had taken those trips as well. Imogen mumbled and took a deep breath. It was time for her careful inquiries. So, how did you find out about her death? It wasn't in the morning papers, was it? No, I got a call from Simon. Simon was Mr. Harris, the owner of the best garage in the town, and exactly the reason why Imogen had agreed on this lunch. He was called into the accident. He said he'd never seen that much blood. Unlike Mrs. Harris, whose eyes shone in excitement, Imogen felt a bit sick, and the carrot patties were hardly to blame. And the worst thing, she drove into a barn. You know, the old one, on the sharp side of the road. There was an old plow here, and smack. Now, Imogen was definitely nauseous. So she whirred off the curve then? She assumed. Well, it had rained the day before, and Simon said there was nothing wrong with her car, so yes, it's all her driving. And he also said there was all that manure there. They had to pretty much dig out her car out of all this filth. Imogen decisively put down her fork with a clank and jumped to her feet. "I'm not feeling that well," she mumbled. "I think I'll walk back. Enjoy your lunch." She hastily paid for her plate of grass and rushed out of the cafe. The second half of Imogen's day consisted of 5 attempts to ring her friend Oliver, for reasons not to be disclosed, an extensive research online into buying a new mobile, 5 cups of coffee for the mayor, and then a futile attempt to sneakily replace it with decaf, more emails from the Americans, and eventually a long and miserable bus ride home. Her trip to the Marys with the mayor, and Imogen made sure to remind herself that she was the only one to whom it sounded anyhow ambiguous, was to take place after lunch, and the first half of the next day Imogen spent working and nervously chewing the rubber on her pencil. During lunch, she galloped out of the office and jumped on the bike she'd borrowed from her neighbor's son in the morning. She pedaled so fast that it felt like her hair were growing twice as quickly in the turbulence. Thankfully, the Fleckney Woulds Comprehensive was just a 7-minute ride away, and Imogen whizzed into the schoolyard. She could see the black car of Andrew's boss, Detective Inspector Ballinson, parked by the main entrance. Imogen quickly turned around the building. She stuffed her bike into the ball shed and pranced into the gymnasium doors. The schedule of the classes hadn't changed since Imogen's days, and she waved to Mrs. DeRossi, the drama teacher, and sneaked through. While she was navigating the corridor with a, hopefully nonchalant expression on her face, she could just feel how charged the air was. There were whispers and glances. Pupils were standing in corners, heads leaned together. A familiar teacher rushed by Imogen without noticing her. "Mops!" Imogen turned and saw Andrew standing by the wall, taking photos of the schedule with his camera. Imogen plastered a smile on her face. "Afternoon." She gave him an awkward wave and immediately regretted it. She never waved like this, and Andrew's eyebrows jumped up. This surely looked suspicious, Imogen scolded herself. To smooth down the suspicious behavior, she did the most logical thing. She acted completely out of her character. She came up to him and, rising on tiptoes, kissed his cheek. It was a good thing Andrew had a high forehead. Otherwise, his eyebrows would meld with his curls. "How are you?" And now she also sounded excessively cheerful, as if bladdered or on drugs. "Working," Andrew answered slowly. "And you?" Just visiting Oliver. Thought I'd ask him out for lunch or something." "I see." Andrew gave her a long, studying look over. "He's being interviewed with other teachers about Mrs. Fitzroy's death. You've heard, I assume?" "Yes. A car accident yesterday morning." For some inconceivable reason, Imogen still sounded very jolly, but she decided that if she tried to change her facial expression, she'd look bipolar. It was an accident, right? Andrew's face grew calm and inexpressive, and Imogen's heart dropped. "We don't know all the circumstances yet," Andrew answered in his best professional voice. "Oh, no." Imogen breathed out and pressed her hands to her cheeks. "So it was a murder." Andrew shushed her, and without thinking, Imogen grabbed his sleeve and dragged him to the nearest door. She jerked it open and stuffed him into, as it turned out, a supply pantry. She pressed her back into the door, locking poor Andrew inside, and flipped the switch. There was just enough room for her and a large mail between the shelves of paper towels, tissue boxes, and bottles of cleaning liquids, leaving about a foot between their bodies. Imogen sank her nails into Andrew's forearm. "I know it's confidential, but please." Imogen gave him a pleading look. "Tell me what you know." Andrew gulped. Imogen saw the throat bob, and she added pressure into her grasp. "Andrew." Chapter 5. A Gnome and a Tart. "Mops, you know I can't tell you any details before the investigation's complete," Andrew muttered, trying to free himself of Imogen's grip. He was in no luck. There was nowhere to retreat, and she was blocking the only exit. So, it was a murder, wasn't it? Otherwise, you and Ballinson wouldn't be here questioning everyone. Mr. Fitzroy called the town hall last night, demanding to speed up the investigation. I need to know how the gnome died. Imogen cleared her throat awkwardly. I mean, Mrs. Fitzroy. The gnome? Andrew asked, professional interest replacing inexplicable panic in his eyes. Yeah, that's how I, Oliver, and about a dozen of her colleagues called her. Imogen admitted grudgingly. You know, she was small and sort of shifty. She was your height, Andrew noted, and Imogen shrugged. But I don't walk up to people quietly to eavesdrop. Imogen bit her tongue and blushed. She was supposed to be the one abusing their friendship and milking him for information, not the other way around. She resumed her interrogation. Andrew, was there something suspicious about the car? I need to know because if it were the road, it's a town hall issue and— It wasn't the road, Mops. Andrew interrupted and sighed. Mops, I can't tell you anything. Imogen had only one weapon left in her arsenal. She wasn't called Mops for nothing. The nickname had been given to her by her sister when they were kids, having caused Imogen lashings of hurt over years, and the basis behind it was Imogen's turn-up nose and the eyes. They were huge, round, of an odd greenish-brownish color, and they did stand out. Imogen moved even closer to Andrew and looked up, just like all those films with Audrey Hepburn taught her. Eyebrows raised under a specific angle, and cue Puss from Shrek. She didn't exactly have that many people in her life to use the weapon on, since no one cared that much what Imogen felt or needed, to be honest. But she'd been spared several library fines for overdue books, and an occasional driver would yell at her just a tad less for her biking escapades. That was the first time Andrew had ever been subjected to the Puss maneuver, and the result was more than satisfactory. He gulped again and glanced behind him, looking mildly terrified. Clearly his defenses were crumbling. Why? His voice broke, and he started coughing spasmodically. Why do you even care? It's so not like you Mops to bother with gossip. Andrew, please, I properly need to know. It's important. Imogen cranked up the Hepburn factor. Oh, all right, Andrew exclaimed and leaned forward. His long, narrow nose was right in front of her. It wasn't the road. It wasn't the car. She had some sort of a seizure and drove into that barn and into— Andrew stopped himself and gave her a concerned look. Mops, I don't want to overwhelm you with ghastly details. She drove into a plow. I know, Andrew. Mrs. Harris told me. Imogen pinned Andrew with a firm glare. What sort of a seizure? The autopsy was yesterday. Her husband had applied pressure on the coroner's office, but Ballinson didn't tell me anything. We will be questioning her doctor tonight. And Mops, I need to go now. Andrew begged Imogen released his sleeve. She needed more information. As much as she hated it, she had to ensure Andrew would let her know the results of the autopsy and whatever him and the DI managed to find out from the doctor and the family. Andrew, could I invite you for dinner tomorrow? She blurted out. Andrew, who'd straightened out by then and was edging towards the door, froze and gawked at her. You've been so very helpful the other day when I fell in the ditch and my bike, and I thought I'd cook your favorite lamb as a thank you. Imogen gave him a wide, properly artificial smile. Andrew stared. Imogen held her breath, partially in anticipation of his answer, partially from the remorse she was feeling for manipulating her friend this way. Do you mean your place? Dinner at your place? Andrew asked in an oddly raspy voice. Imogen wasn't quite sure why he was so surprised. Is he worried about food poisoning? She cooked, and quite well, and he knew it. She'd always invited him over after the fetes where he drove her and the children, and when they were teens, he often had tea at their place. Yeah, just you and me, some food, a chat, just a chat, you know. Here, Imogen decided the wisest thing to do now was to shut her gob. since she sounded as nonchalant and natural as a saw meeting a nail in a plank. Andrew's eyes were glassy for a second or two, and then he nodded. "Sure, yeah, dinner and a chat. When should I come, or I could pick you up at work?" "Just come over around 9. Is 9 too late? I'm not sure what a policeman's hours are. We can do later." Imogen rushed to ensure he'd actually come. This line of hers produced a strange twitch of Andrew's left eye. "9 is perfect," he muttered. "Perfect then," Imogen parroted, and squeezing by him, she tried to flee the pantry. She couldn't quite look into his eyes, feeling that he would see through her schemes if he only looked more attentively. She jerked the door open, stepped out, and into the wide, suit-clad chest of D.I. Ballinson. "Oh, dear. Afternoon," Imogen mumbled. The inspector gave her an impish look over. "Afternoon, Miss Fox. Would my sergeant happen to be here with you?" "He is. Yes, he's inside. Was inside. With me." Imogen waved somewhere behind herself, at the direction of Andrew, who'd just stepped out of the door as well, and stood petrified in front of his superior officer. The dark eyes of D.I. Ballinson twinkled under bushy gray eyebrows. "Cooper, if you're quite done here." The inspector gave Andrew what was called a knowing smirk. "Straighten yourself up and let's go talk to the headmistress." "Yes, sir." Andrew cleared his throat and left without giving Imogen another look. "Well, I'll be going then, too," Imogen squeaked. "Actually, Miss Fox, I'd love to have a word with you, too. When you have a moment, if you could stop by the station." The D.I. gave her a polite smile. According to Andrew, the man was as cunning as Imogen's namesake and endlessly perceptive. There was no point in trying to hide much from him. Imogen nervously swallowed. "I have half a day off on Thursday, and I'll of course come in, but—" "What's it all about?" she asked in a scratchy voice. "Just to clarify a few things, that's all," Ballinson answered benevolently. Imogen sniffled, promised to be there, and fled. It was now time to pedal back to the office. On the way out, Imogen stopped in the reception and learnt that Oliver had called sick in the morning. If he was indeed lying home ill, he wouldn't pick up his mobile. But of course, the news made Imogen only more worried. She arrived back at the Mayor house, hungry and exhausted from her tour to Fleckney. She rushed to the table with the kettle and the coffee machine, but both were empty, just as the box from the morning pastries. Imogen threw a mournful look into the icing, sugar-covered bottom. "Are you ready?" The mayor's voice shook her out of her starving thoughts. For a second, she couldn't suss out what he was asking about, but then she remembered their trip to the Mears. The mayor held his coat in his hands, and Imogen habitually ogled him adoringly. Her all-time favorites were in place: a crooked tie, his disheveled dark curls, his lush, short beard, touching which, just once really, just to know how it felt, was on Imogen's bucket list, and his slightly drawn-together, thick, glossy eyebrows. Imogen fancied everything about him, purely platonically and professionally, of course. Thank you very much. And this grumpy semi-frown of his was no exception. Imogen picked up her own coat and followed the mayor down the hall and into the reception. He was looking into his phone, so she had to steer him away from his favorite corner of the bookshelf, 3 thumps in the last fortnight, and the recently popular table, which Imogen first had stopped putting the vase on and then considered buying those soft-rubbed corner protectors for. It would be done for the sake of the table, of course, not the mayor's hip, because Imogen was not under any circumstances thinking about the mayor's hips. They were approaching the entrance hall when Imogen heard Mr. Dudgeon. Imogen hissed like a suddenly picked-up cat and grabbed the mayor's forearm. He looked from his mobile, one eyebrow hiked up. "It's Mr. Dudgeon. We need to use another exit." "Mr. Dudgeon?" Imogen jerked her hand from the warm, firm forearm under the jacket sleeve. "Yes, Mr. Dudgeon, the gentleman who protests our dam." The mayor gave her his habitual, "speak on, please" twitch of his right eyebrow. "Our dam, built in 1936, Imogen reminded him, which Mr. Dungeon considers unhistorical and suggests demolishing for the sake of preserving the real Fleckney Woulds. Oh. The mayor's lips rounded. Shall we use the tunnel? Indeed, Imogen agreed, and they turned around and headed to the stairs leading to the basement. The old mill, which later had become the Mayor House, had had a tunnel leading out into the fields, a secret hidden behind a bookshelf, dusty and dark tunnel. It had been discovered by the architect in charge of the building's renovations in 1962, and since then the secret of it had been passed from an inhabitant to an inhabitant. There was even a non-disclosure form an employee of the house was to sign. Presently, those were the mayor, Imogen, and Mrs. Harris, who were in the know. Imogen could bet the tunnel looked very inviting to Mrs. Harris at the moment, since she was the one to deal with Mr. Dungeon. The man was shockingly agile and loud for a 92-year-old, and he could go on talking for hours, seemingly without drawing a breath. They picked up the torches, hanging by the entrance of the tunnel, walked through, hid the torches in the specifically allocated flower pots on the other end, on the outside, and briskly walked to the garage. Imogen sighed at the prospect of the ordeal of climbing into the mayor's Range Rover. Being short was quite a nuisance sometimes. She liked being in his car, though. It was clean, but not as impeccable as Andrew's, where she always tried to sit as still as possible, worried she'd make a mess. The mayor's Range Rover smelled nice, too, woody and spicy. The mayor also was an excellent driver, fast and confident, and Imogen always felt safe and cozy in it. 10 minutes into the drive, the mayor suddenly veered and tucked the car into a parking spot in front of a tea shop. "Are you hungry?" he asked. While Imogen was going to loudly protest and reassure, her stomach decided to speak up. A loud, mournful gurgle was its answer to the man. "Perfect," the mayor said with a nod. He grabbed his keys and jumped out of the car. Imogen scampered after him. He pushed the door, the bell above it rang, and Imogen's knees buckled. It smelled amazing inside. "Are we taking away—" Imogen started asking, but the mayor already strode to a table by the window. Imogen minced after him. They sat down and opened their menus. Everything sounded good to Imogen, and she hungrily swallowed. "You sighed every time we passed a food place," the mayor grumbled, his eyes on the menu, "and I could use some sugar." He flipped the page, probably to browse the pudding options. Meanwhile, Imogen wasn't looking at the menu. She was sitting, her eyes widened, her chest rising in short pants. He noticed she was hungry and decided to feed her. John Thomas Crispin Oakby, who didn't notice the furniture and once continued reading his emails when papers in his bin had caught fire, had actually been focused on her enough to observe her throw longing looks at Cafe. More so, he acknowledged and analyzed those longing looks, and was now feeding her. Oh, be still, Imogen's heart. "What do you think of a bacon and watercress tart?" he asked without looking up, and absent-mindedly ruffled the silky curls on the top of his head. "I think it's most wonderful," Imogen whispered, and he nodded and continued reading his menu. Chapter 6. The Benches. "Well, I quite see what you meant," the mayor drew out, giving the mirrors around him a long look over. The mirrors had been around for centuries. Each era had added something to them. Hanging bridges, pathways, 3 gazebos, slowly coming to a sad end in the last 50 years. And of course, the benches. Presently, the park carried the traces of exactly the activities it was used for now. Bottles, cigarette packs, wraps, and other rubbish of indistinguishable nature. All the telltale signs of juvenile delinquency. "Don't we clean this along with other parks?" The mayor grumbled and ruffled his hair. "It's not officially a park, so it's left out. Only the benches are protected by the Town Preservation Act." Imogen pointed at one of them. "So we restore and paint them once in 2 years. Mr. Peterson, the owner of the Peterson Hardware, has the supply of the authentic paint." The mayor hummed and came up to one of the benches. It currently sported 3 obscene statements executed in the aforementioned Sharpie marker. burns from cigarettes, and an assortment of scraps and scratches. "Is there your name featured on one of these?" he asked, and threw her an impish side glance. Imogen, who was shuffling through papers in her folder, always stuffed full, always carried with her, froze for a second, and then slowly looked up at him. I doubt it. And if it is, it's hardly in this context." Imogen pointed at the graffiti praising certain parts of the anatomy of an unknown Izzy Wilson. The mayor took a sip of his coffee and emitted a pensive sound in his throat. "Do we have any public opinion polls on the area? Anything?" he asked, and Imogen rustled with her papers again. "I can't say we do. It's just one of those corners that has always been here, and no one actually thinks twice about it. So, if we build a bypass through it, whom will we irritate?" he asked, and she snorted. She quite adored when the left corner of his lips curled up like that. Well, not adored. Appreciated aesthetically. "Well, there are 2 inhabited cottages here." She pointed west with her pen. "The Honeysuckle. There's a family in it, 4 children. I think they will gladly sell it and move to the estate. Another one is the Willows. That's Mrs. McGillicuddy's residence. She's 92. Used to work in the town library. She's a tough one. Might not want to move." "Then that's where we start." They knocked at the Willows' door. The mayor held the box of sweets they had bought in the tea shop, while Imogen hastily fixed his habitually crooked tie. There was a quiet shuffling inside, and then the door flew open. A pair of bright blue eyes pinned, first the mayor, and then Imogen. "Good afternoon, Mrs. McGillicuddy. Sorry to bother you, but could we intrude for a cup of tea and a chat?" The mayor gave the woman his most handsome smile. Imogen was quite certain that only a blind, deaf, and anosmic person could resist this man when he wanted to charm them. "You're an Oakby boy, aren't you?" Mrs. McGillicuddy gave him a sarcastic look from under a cloud of permed, pearly curls. "I remember you, always on time with returning your books." "I also happen to be the mayor of the town, madam." Oakby gave her a small ceremonial bow. "And this is Miss Imogen Fox, my personal assistant." A bony, crooked finger pointed at Imogen's forehead. "Pastels, workbooks, and art history. Late sometimes, but always gentle with the books." Mrs. McGillicuddy nodded to her, apparently well-catalogued memories. "You may come in." The cottage was bare but clean. They were shown into the drawing room, and the old lady shuffled to the kitchen, where, judging by the sounds, she was now making tea. Imogen looked around. Every available space was taken by books, neatly organized on shelves and tables. There was a small antique desk with seemingly hundreds of photos pinned to a corkboard above it. All pins were of the same size, shape, and color. A large black cat walked into the room and immediately headed to the sofa they were sitting on. It jumped onto the mayor's lap and started purring loudly. Imogen quite expected this. Children and animals adored the mayor. She supposed he had a good vibe, or aura, or some other of that rubbish she didn't believe in. His large, long-fingered hand lay on the cat's head, and he started gently scratching it between the ears. Imogen suppressed an envious sigh. To have one's head scratched like that. Mrs. McGillicuddy came in with a tray, and the mayor tried to rise to help her. The cat made a protesting sound, and judging by the mayor's body twitching and a hiss he emitted, there was some claw sinking involved. Imogen took over and started arranging cups and the milk jug. She habitually poured 3 spoonfuls of sugar into the mayor's cup, stirred, and passed it to him, before picking up one for herself. Their host gave out a small chuckle. "All right, I'll listen to you two," she said after sitting down. "Mr. Kelly here has an excellent taste in people." She pointed at the very pleased-looking cat. The mayor, precariously balancing the cup above the black round head, explained the situation to the woman. She continued giving him a sardonic look all through his speech. "And if I don't want to move? McGillicuddy's lived on this land for 7 generations. We used to farm here, and then it all came to ruin. And where would I go? Not a nursing home, that's for certain. I'm all alone. My husband didn't come back from the war. The children are far away." She shook her head and picked up a biscuit from the box. "I prefer to wait for the end here." "You can go on a cruise," Imogen blurted out, and 3 pairs of eyes stared at her. Imogen blushed and gingerly pointed at the corkboard on the wall. "You have all these postcards, but they're from colleagues and relatives, not your own, and you have travel books, but they are all new." Imogen nodded at the table by the window. "And then you can go visit your daughter in America. You have several of her photos near the Georgia Guidestones. I can see the family resemblance, and the age is appropriate. She's also dressed accordingly." The woman on the photos was exactly the multi-necklaced, layered-skirted New Age person who'd expect to go to the American Stonehenge. There were many of them, and the woman was smiling sincerely and waving in some. "And your cat is named after Edward Kelly, I assume, so I bet you'd love to visit." There was silence in the room, only the soft purring from the mayor's lap heard, and then Mrs. McGillicuddy gave out a surprisingly deep, throaty laugh. "You've got yourself a smart little missus, don't you?" She shook her finger at the mayor. Imogen felt mortified, and it took a couple seconds to finally will her neck to turn so she could check his reaction. Surprisingly, he wasn't rushing to correct the old lady and was just drinking his tea and smiling, his lips curled over the rim of the cup. "Well, all right, maybe a cruise isn't such a bad idea." Mrs. McGillicuddy helped herself to another biscuit. "How much can I expect to shake out of those Americans?" The mayor carefully put down his cup and gave her a sly smile. "Oh, I'm sure we can make them pay for your cruise, and a new flat, and a trip to your daughter, plus a small fortune." "Good," the woman nodded. "Very good." In the evening, Imogen returned the bike to her neighbor's son and headed back towards the Mayer house. She was plodding along the side of the road in her wellies and a raincoat. It was drizzling, and she knew she'd have to go knee-deep to get the bike out. Just as she'd predicted, the cursed machine was stuck deep in the silt. Imogen pulled, and of course the wellies slid, and she plopped on her backside. The trickle of cold goo merrily rushed into her left boot. Imogen silently rolled her eyes, got up on her unstable legs, and pulled again. And that was when the idea came. Her new mobile was supposed to be delivered the next morning to her cottage, so she had no means of communicating with the outside world. But she just needed to share the idea with the mayor. It was, after all, only 8, and surely he wasn't asleep. The keys were floating in her pocket, with a few strings of pondweed and a tadpole. Imogen set the poor animal free, threw the green, slimy leaves aside with a shudder, and leaving her fallen Bucephalus behind, she climbed out of the ditch and sped up towards the house. She knocked at the door to the residence and waited. There was no answer, and she shifted between her feet, loud squelching being the only sound. And then there were steps, and the door opened. Not even the view of him in a soft gray jumper, disheveled with his glasses sitting low on his nose, could distract Imogen from the exciting idea bobbing in her head. "Arboretum!" she hollered into his face. The thick black eyebrows jumped up. Imogen waved her hands in the air, possibly throwing pieces of water, fern, and algae into his face. "We need to move the benches and open a new arboretum in the town. People will love it. There will be a party. People fancy parties, and maybe a fete, and then they will love the idea of the bypass." The mayor was giving her a bewildered look over. She looked like a fab ice lolly with silt coloring her lower part dark green, dry yellow coat in the middle, and the wet top. And then his eyes flew up to her face. He stepped aside, inviting her to come in. "I was getting my bike out of a ditch," Imogen explained, and gave him a shy smile. "I shouldn't go in, I'll tread dirt." "But an arboretum, yeah?" she asked. Suddenly his heavy hand lay on her shoulder, and he pulled her into the parlor. Imogen awkwardly froze while he closed the door and started marching away. "I'll get you something dry," he threw over his shoulder. "Take your clothes off." Imogen couldn't say she hadn't imagined him say these exact words many times before. But of course the circumstances, and especially his intonation in her fantasies, were quite different. But then she realized she was about to put on something of his, and she flushed head to toe. Chapter 7. Come Home. Imogen was sitting in the mayor's kitchen. More so, Imogen was sitting in the mayor's kitchen in the mayor's PJ bottoms, the only item of his lower half clothing that had strings to tighten them around her waist, preventing her from flashing the poor man with her naked backside. She was also wearing his tee and a hooded jumper with a uni logo on it. Imogen was equally in heaven. The clothes were clean and dry, and his. And in the deepest abyss of Tartarus, the clothes were his. She'd taken a shower following his silent command that had come in the form of his index finger pointed towards his bathroom. And now she was clean, smelled like his juniper soap, and was sitting in his kitchen. In his clothes. Imogen's poor mind just wasn't coping. "How do you take your tea?" he asked, his back to her. He was making them cuppas, and Imogen was sitting, her feet tucked under her, on one of his kitchen chairs. The flat was clean but felt lived in and cozy. Mrs. Roberts, the cleaner for most minted houses in Fleckney Woulds who visited the mayor's house once a week, had once stopped by the town hall, and Imogen and her had had tea, biscuits, and a chat. Mrs. Roberts wasn't usually inclined to discuss her clients, but Imogen was the one who'd found her the job, and after all, everything Mrs. Roberts had to say was of the kind one could say about someone who was dead. Mrs. Roberts said the mayor was organized, did his dishes and laundry, and didn't ruin the kitchen when cooked, although he pretty much never did, just ordering takeaway. He was apparently mostly fond of margarita pizza and Willie's fish and chips. He left endless mugs with traces of sweet coffee all over the flat, but otherwise, nothing to complain, Mrs. Roberts said. And most importantly, not a woman or a party in sight. "Makes me life lashings easier," she added, and Imogen had trouble faking a nonchalant face. At the moment, Imogen was industriously studying the row of the aforementioned mugs on the counter, with the sole purpose of not looking at his back. Twice a week, the mayor went to Frake's gym and spa. Imogen was the one booking him sessions with Adam, the best fitness trainer in Fleckney Woulds. Currently, the glorious results of Adam's efforts, previously hidden under suits, were on display. The long muscles on his back, his bulging biceps, and all gods and deities save Imogen. His wonderfully sculpted buttocks were giving Imogen palpitations due to the softness of his pale gray jumper and the worn-out denim, sitting low on his hips. "Imogen?" He called her back to reality without turning. "Cream and sugar, same as you," she squeaked. He placed a mug in front of her and stirred his. "What about the arboretum?" he asked, sitting down in front of her. He focused his mesmerizing, bright blue, framed with black, like of a husky dog, eyes on her. It helped. Firstly, the buttocks were finally out of sight. Secondly, all her adoration and lust towards him aside, she was a professional. The current Mrs. Fitzroy, the lady of the manor, is a major patron of parks and nature. Imogen started her explanation, which is lucky for us since the previous one was into dogs and hunt, and that was dreadful. The current Mrs. Fitzroy being the mother-in-law of the recently killed Mrs. Patricia Fitzroy. Imogen nodded, confirming. "Is she number 3? 4. Good Lord. And there are children from all of them, right?" The mayor sipped his tea. "Yes. The oldest son is Mr. James Fitzroy." Imogen cleared her throat. "The now widower. He also has a younger sister, Clara. She's 24. The second Mrs. Fitzroy had 2 daughters, twins. They are 16 now. Mrs. Fitzroy, number 3, has another daughter, and the latest Mrs. Fitzroy has a son from her first marriage, whom Mr. Fitzroy has formally adopted." "So, who would benefit from Mrs. Fitzroy's death, then?" the mayor asked, and Imogen choked on her cuppa. "All of them, I assume. So it's a murder, sir." "Her husband seems to think so." The mayor put down his mug and stretched, his long legs under the table and the massive arms up and behind him. Imogen wondered if one could die of sudden rush of arousal due to one's all systems going into overload. The mayor's jumper slid up, displaying the flat, slightly furry stomach, while the view of his arched back was the most sensual picture Imogen had ever had the privilege to observe. He made a half-groan, half-rumble sound in his throat, and then slumped in his chair. "So we open an arboretum. Mrs. Fitzroy gets a plaque. The town gets its precious benches." He then gave Imogen an impish side glance. "And you, Imogen, get a raise." "Thank you, sir." Imogen beamed. "All right, and now let's get your bike out of that ditch and get you home." "Sir?" she asked, confused, but he already jumped off his chair and was heading somewhere into the depth of his house. "Get your wellies, Imogen," he shouted from somewhere. There was some noise. He moved in the back rooms, and then something thudded on the floor. "Where are the damn keys?" Judging by the tone, he wasn't addressing her, but the heaven above. "They're by the door, on the console table," Imogen shouted to him while scampering towards the hallway. He appeared out of the rooms. Socks and a leather jacket added to his previous outfit. The socks were duckling yellow. Perfect. He put on his shoes and grabbed the keys. "Off you pop!" "But my clothes are still in your washer," Imogen mumbled, pulling on her boots. "You'll pick them up tomorrow. I promise to throw them in the dryer." He opened the door, and she minced by him and outside. While Imogen had spent more than 10 minutes trying to pull the bike out of the dirty water, the mayor just grabbed the frame, jerked, and there it was, in all its old and ragged glory, as if it had jumped into his embrace on its own. Imogen wouldn't blame it if it had. She was shifting her weight between her feet on the side of the road, nervously pulling up the leg of the mayor's bottoms, worried to mar them with mud. "Does this bike have a driving license of its own?" Oakby asked, giving it a sarcastic look over. "It was my mum's," Imogen shared for no reason. The mayor was already heading to the car, carrying the bike in one hand. Imogen predictably swooned. "Talk to Jones on U Lane. He'll restore it for you for half price." All Imogen could do was to ogle him adoringly and climb back into the car. With the bike strapped to the back of the Rover, they headed towards Imogen's cottage, which was preceded by a very interesting conversation. "Where do you live, Imogen?" the mayor asked when both of them were inside. Imogen couldn't hold back a giggle. He dropped her off and picked her up on 7 separate occasions. Indeed, his memory was very selective. She gave him the address, and he started the car. "Is it that tiny cottage on Bjornson's land?" "Yes. Mr. Bjornson is my landlord. The cottage belonged to my grandmother, then my parents lived in it, and afterwards, when my sister married and moved out, I was the last one left there." "It's the size of a matchbox," the mayor said warmly. "Vixen Run, isn't it?" Imogen nodded. She was quite proud of her home, to be honest. It was indeed very small, but she'd spent the last 5 years renovating it, and she thought it was quite charming. "Appropriate name," the mayor chuckled. "Before my grandmother moved in, it was called the Granary, and the land belonged to Mr. Bjornson's father. He renamed the cottage for my Nana. She was a redhead like me, but attractive." The mayor threw a quick look at Imogen's hair. He was very fond of her. Imogen laughed at the memories of the old Swede. Such had been the nickname of the old Mr. Bjornson. Stopping by their home when Imogen was about 5, he would always bring a box of her Nana's favorite biscuits and stay for tea. They would have been 70 or so then, both of them. The mayor parked by Imogen's cottage, and while she was still trying to slide out and off the impossibly tall seat, he was already at the back, unclasping the bike. "Imogen?" a small voice called to her, and she saw Kathy and Brian sitting on the steps of her home. "Oh my goodness, what are you two doing here? It's past 11!" Imogen exclaimed and rushed to them, forgetting the mayor, the bike, and anything else. "We ran away," Brian muttered. He'd been obviously sleeping pressed into his sister's side. "You weren't answering your phone." Kathy's voice was trembling. "Mum's come home and Tommy was with her. They were fighting. Can we stay here, please?" Imogen was already unlocking her door to let them in. It was rather cold outside. Get in now," she muttered. Imogen? She'd forgotten about the mayor. She twirled and saw him stand on the pathway, her bike again in his hand, eyebrows raised in a silent question. "Is that the mayor?" Kathy asked in a terrified whisper. "Get inside." Imogen gave the children a gentle nudge and rushed to the mayor. "I'm sorry, sir. I seem to have a family emergency." "Are those your sister's children?" he asked, placing the bike on the ground. "Yes, and they seem to have come here without asking. It won't interfere with my work, I swear." She pressed her hands to her chest. "I won't be late tomorrow, I promise." He gave her an odd look. "You can take a day off if you need." No, it's absolutely unnecessary. Kathy will take the school bus and I'll find someone to look after Brian. It's past 11. You won't find anyone right now." "But I will," Imogen insisted. "I have to go see the police before work anyway." The mayor, who was wiping his hands on his jeans, froze and then looked down at her. "Why?" "Inspector Ballinson asked me to stop at the station. We have a late opening day tomorrow, remember? So I told him I'd drop by." "Is it about Mrs. Fitzroy? What do you have to do with it?" Imogen felt like pressing her head into her shoulders and cowardly backing away from him. "I don't know, really," she lied, everything shaking inside of her. "I'm one of her former pupils. Maybe something from that time. I really don't know." Imogen indeed was a very poor liar. The mayor studied her for a few seconds. Each of them made Imogen's feet feel colder and colder, and her fists hidden behind her back grow tighter and tighter. And then he nodded and turned to his car. "Take all the time you need tomorrow. Just give the office a ring," he threw over the shoulder and disappeared inside the Rover. Imogen squeaked, "I will," and rushed inside her cottage. Chapter 8. That Old Story. The morning was hectic. Delivering Brian to Rosie's neighbor he was staying with during the day was the first on the list of the things Imogen had no time for. Making sure Kathy caught her school bus was on top of the, "Oh, fiddlesticks, how am I going to manage this?" register. And then Adam, the postman, had to chase Imogen half the street to give her the parcel with her new mobile in it. While tearing the packaging with her teeth, Imogen already had the list of 5 people she had to ring up. Eventually, the prospect of being interrogated by the police on a certain subject, she had an idea which didn't seem that daunting anymore. When she plopped on an uncomfortably hard chair in the reception area and stretched her legs, she felt almost like she was on holes. "Mops?" Andrew's voice came from above, as his voice always did considering his 6'4" height, and she tore her eyes off her mobile, where she was setting up her apps and her mail. She jumped to her feet and minced after him. She was hoping to be led to the constable hall, where the desks, computers, and chairs for visitors were, and people rushed back and forth. She'd been there before, when picking up work papers. When Andrew opened a room into an actual interrogation room, she gulped. "Don't be nervous," he whispered into her ear, and Imogen threw him a grateful yet nervy look. "Have you eaten today?" Andrew asked. He was, of course, aware that Imogen tended to forget. She didn't want to be a bother, and he gave her a soft smile and nodded. "I'll get you a coffee and a bite." And that's why Imogen ended up alone in the room with Inspector Ballinson and a female constable by the door, who was more of an incredibly gorgeous-looking statue than a live human because she wasn't even looking at Imogen. "Please sit, Ms. Fox. Constable Ove will be present during our conversation, as per regulations." Imogen gave him and then the constable an uncertain smile and tucked herself in a terrifyingly gray chair. Ballinson was flipping through some papers. Imogen was quietly vibrating on her seat. If that was Andrew attempt to be a good friend to her, he was doing a poor job of it. D.I. Ballinson, with his soft tone and considerate words, had always reminded Imogen of an Airedale terrier. Kind, twinkly eyes and a death grip of jaws. If you had anything to hide, and who didn't, he'd dig it up and bury you instead. Finally, Andrew was back, with a coffee for her and the inspector, and a Chelsea bun. Imogen threw it a doubtful look. Chewing while being interrogated felt wrong. "Do help yourself, Miss Fox." The DI gave her a warm smile, clearly seeing right through her. "My sergeant here claims you tend to be distracted when hungry." It might have been the hunger, but Imogen felt irritated at Andrew for making her look feeble. It just was a tad patronizing, wasn't it? "I have hypoglycemia, Mr. Ballinson. I do tend to feel tired when the blood sugar drops, but the scatterbrained character and the klutziness are natural and can't be improved with sugar or caffeine." The DI gave out a chuckle, and Imogen smiled at him. She took a sip and sank her teeth into the bun. "As you have probably assumed, you're here to answer a few questions regarding the death of Mrs. Patricia Fitzroy." The inspector gave her a sharp look. At this stage, it's obvious that the death needs to be treated as suspicious. Mrs. Fitzroy died as a result of a car accident when she lost control of her vehicle, which was caused by poisoning. Imogen swallowed the sticky ball of dough in her mouth and squeaked, "Poisoning?" "Yes. There was a high level of DNP in her blood. Are you familiar with the substance, Miss Fox?" Imogen couldn't say she was, so she shook her head. 2,4-dinitriphenol, known as simply DNP, is a banned drug that is used in diet pills, which one can obtain illegally abroad, or, as it is these days, quite easily through the internet. The levels of it in Mrs. Fitzroy's blood are consistent with a triple overdose. Ballinson gave Imogen a long look. According to Mrs. Fitzroy's GP and her family, the victim did not take any diet medications or in any way express the desire to lose weight, other than by eating healthy and exercising in the gym. Well, if they are illegal, wouldn't she have hidden them from everybody? Imogen asked quickly, and immediately wondered if an innocent person would keep their gob shut in this situation. And then she reminded herself she was an innocent person. Possibly, but Mrs. Fitzroy has been characterized as a prudent, careful person. Would you say it was possible she was that negligible as to triple her dosage? Ballinson asked. I didn't know her that well. Imogen mumbled and hid behind her mug of coffee. She was your teacher for 3 years, and then again, there was the story of your application to the art school. Imogen threw a look at Andrew. His lips were pressed in a stressed line, and he was watching her face intently. "Several of Mrs. Fitzroy's colleagues have mentioned it, Miss Fox," the inspector said, and Imogen dropped her eyes at her hands, clutched on the table. "Not just your application, mind you," he added. There had been others who were disgruntled by Mrs. Fitzroy. "I wasn't disgruntled," Imogen exclaimed. "What she's done was awful, but it wasn't exactly a surprise. Everyone knew what she was like." "So you were not surprised to find out she'd sabotaged your application for an art school. Is that what you're saying? She was on the school council and was responsible for students' applications. Have you ever had a chance to read the letter she sent to the art school, characterizing you as a mediocre artist, borrowing ideas from her classmates?" Imogen chewed her bottom lip. She couldn't dare to look up. I have seen the letter. Several years after, when I was already working at the town hall, a copy of it was sent to my workplace, anonymously." "And do you think it was Mrs. Fitzroy who sent it to you?" "Yes," Imogen whispered. "Why?" Imogen sighed. "Because she liked torturing people. Not getting in was painful, but to know that I had had a chance, if not for a letter, was much worse." She looked up at the inspector sadly. "I also think that she might have taken some of my works out of my portfolio then. You see, I was quite good, and I had a chance to get in and to receive a scholarship, which I needed, and they didn't even offer me to stay for the full fee, so I think she might have taken out some of my best pieces." Imogen cringed. "But like I said, I hadn't been very hopeful, to be honest, and it was just a naive dream, really. What would I have done after the art school? There aren't that many jobs for artists, and watercolorists especially, for that matter. Most of my classmates who were any good had to go to the city college and find a job just like me. Such as your friend, Oliver Pemberton? Ballinson asked. He's now a colleague of Mrs. Fitzroy. Was her colleague? Yes, but Oliver has always wanted to be a teacher. Imogen immediately rushed to her friend's defense. And he was more interested in sciences. He wasn't, as you say, disgruntled by Mrs. Fitzroy in our school days. Is he disgruntled with her now? It seems Mrs. Fitzroy wasn't the easiest person to work with. Ballinson's offhanded tone hardly deceived Imogen. Not enough to kill her. If you think it's her conduct that caused it, half the town are your suspects. Half the town are my suspects, Miss Fox, Ballinson answered levelly, but you have to agree you should be placed on top of the list. But why would I kill her now? It's been years, and I'm quite content in my life these days. I'm the mayor's administrative assistant. I just got a raise, just last night. You got a raise at night? Andrew asked loudly. Imogen threw him a surprised look. That was, after all, the first time he spoke since she'd sat down in this room. And what a strange question it was. The mayor and I have sussed out what to do with the mirrors last night. It was my idea. Imogen jerked her chin up. I'm good at my job, and what does it matter now that I could have been an artist? One has to be practical, after all. It's not like I can marry into money and draw all day. Perhaps you've recently found a method to commit the murder, Miss Fox. You've had the motive, and poisoning provides more opportunities than, say, stabbing or shooting. Imogen frowned. Ballinson sounded as if he were discussing planting petunias and not ending a human life. And recently, if I'm not wrong, there has been a growing tension among the faculty of the Fleckney Comprehensive, mainly between your friend Mr. Pemberton and Mrs. Fitzroy. Perhaps you decided to kill two birds with one stone. I didn't kill her. I was shocked to find out she was dead. I would never kill anyone. I know you deal with hard evidence, sir, but I'm sure some people could vouch for my character. I'm no cold-blooded murderer. I just couldn't... Imogen's voice trembled. She didn't look at Andrew, though, not to create a conflict of interest for him. Poor thing, he was probably torn between his friendly feelings and being a good policeman. Several people indeed have vouched for your character, Miss Fox, Ballinson said, and looked at Andrew sideways. But we do need to explore all lines of investigation, as you understand. Imogen nodded and grabbed the mug with her already lukewarm coffee. After a few more questions about her whereabouts in the last few days and her familiarity with Mrs. Fitzroy's daily routine and living arrangements, of which Imogen knew nothing besides the general town gossip, she was let go. Andrew caught up with her in the reception area. "Mops, are you okay?" he asked softly and leaned in, looking into her face. Imogen was bedraggled and had an irritated thought that he was treating her like a frightened child, but then she forced herself to smile. After all, he was just trying to take care of her. "Yeah, I'm good. It was unpleasant to drag that story out again, but I really have nothing to do with her death." "Of course you don't," he said hotly, and his hand lay on her shoulder comfortingly. "I'd told so to Ballinson, but just as he said, we need to talk to everyone." "Sure." Imogen nodded. She was feeling her, sadly frequent, migraine setting in. "I need to go to the town hall. It's time to open up. Andrew, the thing about the dinner tonight..." Imogen huffed air in unease. "Kathy and Brian stayed the night yesterday, and I'm not sure what's going on. Do you mind if I give you a ring midday once I talk to Rosie?" Andrew frowned. "Of course. Just let me know." Imogen patted his hand, muttered her goodbyes, and set off back to the mayor's house. She had a strange feeling that Andrew didn't believe her about the children, but why would she lie about it? Chapter 9. Where Credit is Due. By the time Imogen was to arrive at the mayor's house, there were 3 messages on her phone. Surprisingly, none of them was from the mayor. She'd assume he'd forget about her appointment with the police and the children in her house by the time he'd gotten into his Rover in front of her cottage the night before, and ring her up to ask where she was. But apparently, some of the information had gotten retained. One of the messages was from Rosie, and Imogen got off the bus a stop too early to give her sister a ring back without all the usual passengers eavesdropping on it. The decision proved itself quite wise as soon as Rosie picked up. It was around 10 to midday, and Imogen could hear just how far from sober her sister was. "Mops, what's cooking?" The fact that Rosie sounded as if chuffed to hear Imogen's voice was only confirming the latter's suspicions. "Rosie, I'm ringing to find out what's going on with Kathy and Brian." There was some loud music in the background. Imogen wondered whether it was telly or an actual do going on. "Now's going on with them," Rosie dismissed, and someone called her name. So, not the telly then. "They were buggering me yesterday and I sent them your way. It's not like they would intrude on some goings-on with you." Rosie's voice grew somewhat lispy. Imogen could just imagine the cigarette pressed between Rosie's lips now. "It was the middle of the night, Rosie," Imogen hissed, covering the mobile with the second hand. She might have been walking in an empty street, but there were ears everywhere in Fleckney Woulds. "Well, they had enough money for the bus and they know the way." Imogen sighed. "So, will you pick them up after school today?" She was almost certain she knew the answer to this question. "Listen, Mops, the things is..." Here it was. "Me and Tommy are having such ace time here, and..." Rosie's voice dropped to conspiratorial whisper. "I think we might be getting serious, yeah? The bloke has serious intentions, you know." Imogen lifted her eyes to the surprisingly blue and clear sky and asked all gods and deities where exactly she was supposed to get the patience for yet another of Rosie's blokes with serious intentions. "So, it's best if the little buggers are out of the way for a wee bit, yeah?" Rosie said. "Rosie, I can't," Imogen started, knowing well enough nothing she said would have any effect. "Besides other things, you haven't paid Brian's sitter for 5 weeks, and I have absolutely no—" "Mops, I properly have no time for your whining," Rosie interrupted, sounding quite irritated now. "I'm taking a sickie today. Tommy's taking me shopping, so toodaloo, okay, Mops?" And she hung up without waiting for Imogen's answer. Somehow it was suddenly quite too much for Imogen, who froze in the middle of a street in front of a small floral shop. The pretty arrangements and pot plants swam in front of Imogen's eyes, blurred by the daft tears that rolled over without Imogen's participation, and she sniffled. There was a man inside, buying a small bouquet of irises, and Imogen thought mournfully that she'd never in her life been given flowers, and no one had ever bent over the counter, like the bloke inside, signing the card, and the shop assistant had never tied a pretty yellow ribbon around the bouquet, just for her, for Imogen. To think of it, imaginary gifted flowers were hardly the top priority at the moment. Just someone asking whether she had enough money to pay for her tea today, which she did not, would be most welcome. With the bills, the bike repairs, the new phone, the money she, of course, had already paid Brian's sitter, and the groceries she needed to get tonight to feed the children, she would have exactly enough to pay for 1 iris, judging by the price tag in the window, and she wouldn't be paid for another week. Imogen had a strict rule of never borrowing money, but she most likely would have no choice. It wasn't just her going to bed hungry these days. She inhaled a shuddered breath. She had a choice of sitting down on a bench in a small park over there and crying her eyes out. Alternatively, she could woman up and go to work. The man in the shop paid and walked out, the bell jingling behind him. He gave her a small nod and quickly crossed the street. The shop assistant inside was faffing around the bouquet, probably preparing it for the delivery. Imogen realized tears were running down her cheeks, so she quickly wiped them and started walking towards the old mill. She estimated it would take her just enough time to get there for her eyes to lose a bit of the disgusting puffiness and redness. She was typing a letter to the parish council when the door of the mayor's office opened and he appeared, his nose down to a paper in his hand, as usual. "We're going with the contract with the Americans," he muttered, and blindly stepped to her desk. Imogen held her breath, wondering whether he'd noticed the visitor chair that was on his way. He didn't. The mayoral knee met the chair. Imogen heard a soft thud. The mayor peeked, and then easily lifted the chair by its back. Imogen swooned. The chair was vintage, and she had trouble pushing it aside with 2 hands, her feet planted firmly on the floor. The chair was relocated couple feet to the side. The blue eyes dropped to the facts again, and the mayor approached Imogen's desk. He started absent-mindedly putting papers on the desk. Imogen hastily saved her mug, the glass with pencils, and the photo frame from being, accidentally, forcefully, and onto the floor, relocated as well. She then caught 2 papers that were fluttering around like giant white bats. The county's insisting, and with the issue of the mirrors solved, we can go through with it. Another sheet made a salto mortale in the air, and Imogen snatched it. "Type, please," the mayor muttered. He stuffed a handwritten and crisscrossed with his flamboyant corrections and arrows, letter, into her outstretched palm. He was adorably old-fashioned when it came to making notes and writing letters, although his WPM was as high as hers. And this one, type as well. Another sheet followed. "This is the letter to HR about your raise. And what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be taking care of the children?" he grumbled, without lifting his eyes off whatever he was reading. "They're at school. Well, Kathy is, and Brian's with the sitter." Imogen started fretting, immediately losing her professionalism and that sense of slightly superior amusement that his endearing quirks always evoked in her. "It's honestly all right, and I'm already done with the police. Nothing important there, really. And thank you," she squeaked, finally remembering to express her gratitude. "For the raise. That was so nice of you." He hummed, as if agreeing that indeed it had been nice of him. Another sheet of paper joined its sisters on the desk, and then the mayor nodded, confirming an unknown thought of his, turned around and went back towards his office. He stopped in front of the closed door. Imogen tried not to, and yet ogled the wide shoulders and the narrow waist. There was no jacket, and the charcoal waistcoat over a light blue shirt made the mayor look Pinterest-worthy. "Have you had lunch?" he suddenly asked. Imogen, who was putting her belongings back on the desk, froze. "Pardon? You look hungry." Imogen wondered whether the man had some unknown psychic powers. He couldn't have noticed even if she was gnawing at a pencil and drooling excessively. He hadn't lifted his eyes for a single moment. I haven't yet." "No," Imogen rasped out. She wasn't going to either. She couldn't afford any, but he didn't need to know it. "Fish and chips, then. Extra vinegar for me." He stuffed his hand in his trouser pocket, pulled out his card, turned, walked up to her, placed the card almost, she moved it, into her coffee mug, turned again, and disappeared in his office. Imogen decided that was the end of her endurance. She quickly rang up Willie's, ordered food for both of them, and went to the office bathroom to bawl. Imogen decided to allow herself 10 minutes of weakness, namely sitting on a loo, bent in half, and crying, biting her index finger to stay quiet. She also decided she wasn't going to hold it against herself just this one time. Hypoglycemia, after all, did affect the nervous system, and unlike many, Imogen didn't display irritability and negativism. In her case, the low blood sugar meant firm and overwhelming sensation of uselessness, unlovability, and deep and dark despair. She seemed to be finally done with feeling sorry for herself, and before the completion of the scheduled 10 minutes, go Imogen! But then her eyes fell on the card she was still clutching in her hand. Imogen tenderly stroked the letters Mr. J.T.C. Oakby with the tip of her finger. T for Thomas, C for Crispin. Imogen felt a new wave of tears coming up, and she painfully bit into her bottom lip. She properly had nothing to complain about, she reminded herself. She had a job. She was paid better than most of those with her diploma-level education. She had a boss who had just bought her lunch. She was just peckish and tired. She tried to reason with herself. And yet she just couldn't shake off the gloom after the morning conversation at the station. As little as hypotheticals mattered in the real world, if not for the late Mrs. Fitzroy, there had been a minuscule, almost non-existent chance that instead of crying her eyes out in a gray-walled office bathroom, out of hunger and the worry of how she was going to take care of 2 children for an unknown period of time, instead of being Mops Fox, the mayor's girl, and that scrawny ginger at the town hall, she could have been Imogen Fox, a watercolorist and an urban sketcher. And even if she'd been as poor and hungry as she was now, she'd spend days doing what she fancied, would have been just a smidge happier and liked herself just a tad more. Chapter 10. Ties and Costumes. The small gathering after Mrs. Fitzroy's funeral, 150 people at least, was held on a Tuesday. Expecting the Fitzroys to care about other people's prior engagements would, of course, be preposterous. Imogen spent the whole morning and afternoon in the office, tolerating the excruciating pain inflicted by the pair of her fanciest, most uncomfortable, and the only pair of stilettos. She, of course, had forgotten her sensible shoes at home. The mayor appeared from his office, his mobile in his hand, 2 ties thrown over his shoulder. "The gray one," Imogen answered without waiting for the question. The mayor hummed and attempted to wrap the tie around his neck with one hand. Imogen emitted a fake, exasperated sigh, clomped towards him, and pulled the tie out of his fingers. The mayor habitually bent to accommodate Imogen's lacking height. Let's face it, she had, and had ever had, 0 romance in her life, and a negative number of the physical side of the above-mentioned romance. But even the virginal Imogen knew what that sweet shiver that ran through her body was. His tanned cheekbone, the thick black beard, the strong neck, contrasted by the white shirt. All of him was right in front of her nose. His eyes were running the lines of whatever email he was reading on his screen, and Imogen saw the lashes flutter. Rarely, very, very rarely, and always for no more than a jiffy, Imogen allowed herself to admit that her feelings towards the man involved anything else besides the superficial crush all females and gay men of Fleckney Woulds had on him. And that was one of those seconds when Imogen let herself imagine what it would feel like to kiss that very cheek and have the right to, because she could just lean it and peck it. Chances are, the man just wouldn't notice. But to be the one who had him in their life in this capacity, to be expected and welcome to touch him, and to receive a smile in return, and perhaps a kiss as well. Imogen quickly lifted his collar, deftly made a perfect Balthus, thank you, YouTube H, and smoothed out the collar, lapels, and the tie. All set. He straightened up without looking up from the mobile, and Imogen suddenly felt sad, and just the way one feels after eating a whole ball of candy floss on an empty stomach, slightly nauseous and still starving. There was no point in these daydreams. All she'd get was an abrupt and painful return to the reality. "Ready?" he asked. Imogen dully confirmed she was and headed to her desk to pick up her purse. The wake had just started when the mayor stopped his rover in front of the Holly Branch mansion. Some colleagues of the late Mrs. Fitzroy had already arrived, and Imogen noticed a few of younger teachers flocking in a corner of the drawing room, talking in hushed voices. Oliver was still nowhere to be seen. Imogen hadn't managed to get in touch with him. She'd even considered texting or ringing up Andrew, since the latter had mentioned that Ollie had been questioned. But then she remembered that she'd been backing off from that supper invitation of hers. The children were still staying at her place, and so she never gathered courage to pick up her phone to call Andrew. Few of Fleckney Woulds' society pillars were already there as well. The judge, the priest of All Saints Church, several business owners. The mayor walked up to Mr. Fitzroy, the widower, with his condolences. Imogen knew her place. She'd get her chance later when all the big fish were done with the adult talk. Also, she was rather certain that the condolences were given and acknowledged only to give room to shop talk. The fact that she knew what the talk was about and could even contribute to it with a lot of benefit was only due to how much the mayor involved her into his work. The rest of the Fleckney Woulds gaffers were much less liberal with their staff. "Good afternoon, Imogen." the voice of Deidre Dyer, née Oakby, shook Imogen out of her thoughts. Imogen greeted the headmistress. The woman looked unwell. She was pale, had dark shadows under her eyes, and a sort of overall stressed air to her. "Afternoon. I'm sorry for the loss your school sustained, Mrs. Dyer." "Ah, yes, thank you," Deidre answered. "Mrs. Fitzroy will be missed." Here Imogen was reminded why Mrs. Dyer's first profession was a math teacher, not a drama teacher. She's quite a poor actor, isn't she? The woman shifted closer to Imogen, who saw the glass of red wine violently shake in the headmistress' hand. "How much does your office know about the investigation?" Mrs. Dyer asked. "Has D.I. Ballinson questioned my brother already?" "As far as I know, Mr. Oakby was invited to an interview yesterday. He came back rather quickly. I don't think he had much to discuss. He had little contact with Mrs. Fitzroy after all." It felt as if the air was vibrating around the dark-haired woman. "Right, of course. Just the preservation committee, but he never stays for tea after the meetings." Mrs. Dyer took a large gulp of her wine. "Imogen, there's a rather delicate matter that I need to discuss with you." The woman's voice wavered, and Imogen looked at her over the water glass. "I have to warn you, it's confidential and potentially could cause a conflict of interest, so you can say no now." The headmistress continued to whisper frantically. "It's just Tommy always says he trusts you more than anyone." Imogen loudly choked on her water. She'd only once before heard the mayor being called Tommy, by his sister that time as well, and she'd quite forgotten how much it clashed in her mind with the image of John Thomas Crispin, Oakby the mayor. And B, he'd said he trusted Imogen more than anyone. "You can trust me too, Mrs. Dyer. If I can't help you with your confident matter, I'll just forget the conversation ever happened," Imogen promised solemnly. The headmistress nodded jerkily and threw Imogen a grateful look. "Would you come for tea tomorrow? It's Saturday, I know, but—" "I will," Imogen promised, but then remembered. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I'd be able to find a sitter for my nephew and niece at such short notice." "Or rather, to afford one," Imogen added in her head. "Bring the children with you. They can play with my sons." Mrs. Dyer gave Imogen another intense look. And again, "Thank you." The headmistress walked away towards the growing crowd of teachers and other guests, and Imogen looked around, searching for Oliver. He was lingering at the back of the room, and when their eyes met, he beckoned her with his hand. She started edging towards him, making small talk, nodding, and keeping her face appropriately forlorn. She had to admit she was one of the last people who still had a mournful look to them. Some seemed to have forgotten to keep the corners of their mouths lowered, perhaps due to the excellent food and the alcohol served so very generously. Some might have chosen to forget the above on purpose. Imogen finally reached Oliver. She was getting the same impression from him that she'd gotten from his boss. He was dressed in black, which matched the circles under his eyes, and he was twitching and ruffling his blonde hair, looking more and more like a parachute sphere of a ripe and dry dandelion. "I need your help," the blonde hissed, shiftily looking around. "Ollie, where have you been?" Imogen answered, analogously in parcel tongue. "I've been trying to reach you in forever, and how about a hello?" "I'll explain later," he answered, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her towards a back door. "Ollie, I don't think we're supposed to go—" Imogen didn't finish, when with a ridiculously fake and utterly suspicious, nonchalant look on his face, Ollie opened the door, just a smidge, pushed her through, lunged after her, and closed the door behind them. "Ollie, what the bloody hell? I need to find her trophy room." Oliver made a strange, spasmodic movement without releasing Imogen's upper extremity. It almost looked as if he were mildly electrocuted. A trophy room. Not a trophy room. Her trophy room. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Imogen wondered if she was imagining that Oliver's left eye was twitching. "Do you mean you believe the rumors?" "They aren't rumors, Mops," Oliver interrupted. "I know they aren't." She kept mementos from each person whose life she'd ruined, and she stored them in a special room. I know because she took one from me and told me she'd add it to others. Oliver's mouth twisted. And when the police finds it, they will trace it back to me, and then I'm done for. Ollie. Imogen was starting to feel panic crawl up her spine. It felt endlessly disgusting, like a hornwort in cold pond water. What have you done? I haven't done anything. He gave her a manic look. But they'll find the milk jug, and they will know it had been mine, and then they'll start digging, and they'll find the photos, and... The man's eyes filled with tears. Ollie. Imogen grabbed his hands. I don't understand. What milk jug? What photos? Oliver didn't answer. He was now trying to twist out of her grasp and apparently venture on his search expedition. Imogen had heard the rumors of Mrs. Fitzroy's trophy room. She never believed them, of course, but was now wondering whether she'd find something of hers there as well. Ollie, you need to tell me what's going on. I can't help if I don't know what mess you've gotten yourself into. Oliver was now marching along a wide corridor, as much as dragging the still-attached Imogen after him. Oliver, we just have to find my jug, and they will never look into it. And... Oliver continued muttering. Ollie, did you have anything to do with her death? The words burst out of Imogen, and her friend dug his heels into the expensive-looking carpet and then whipped his head and stared at her. Are you mental, Mops? Of course not. Then what are you all about? Imogen asked pleadingly. The gnome had compromising photos of me, and she asked for my great-grandmother's milk jug, you know, the Grimwades one. The old cottage chintz? Imogen breathed out in horror. The milk jug had been one of the few possessions Oliver had had left from his maternal great-grandmother. Oliver nodded mournfully. Oh, Ollie. I had no choice, Mops, he exclaimed, and wiped his eyes hastily. She showed me the photos, she said. She'd post them on Facebook and print them and put them around the school. She said such horrible things about me. She didn't ask for money. She knew, of course, I didn't have any. She just said I'd had to take some of her classes without the headmistress finding out, and she asked for the jug. He looked up at Imogen. Mops, I swear I had nothing to do with her death. I know we joked about it, but it was just rubbish, just jokes. But when they get to her collection, and that D.I. Will, he's bloody terrifying, they will start asking questions. Ollie, what's in those photos? Imogen asked, already walking along the corridor. She'd been in the hall several times before, on the official town business, so she had a vague idea of where the late Mrs. Fitzroy's study and library were. Those were the places she thought they should start their investigation. Mops, don't pressure me. The man was checking the doors on the opposite side of the corridor. Ollie, you know I won't judge, but it's never smart to withhold information from your accomplices. Imogen caught his sleeve again. Ollie? Let's say they're provocative. Are you alone in them? For a second, a thought of a pupil being featured in those photos with Oliver rushed through Imogen's mind, but she immediately brushed it aside. Yeah, they were a present. Oh dear, for that bloke from Ukraine who'd chatted you up on Skype? Vladik, yes, and he hadn't chatted me up. Oliver forgot his distress for a mo and jerked his chin up haughtily. We found each other, and we dated for almost 8 months. It was real love. Imogen considered reminding Oliver that the two men had never been on the same continent, but she decided against it. So they are risque, Imogen said. Let's face it, we do live in a small town, but I'm sure people would understand. Their poses and costumes, Oliver said quietly. Imogen closed her mouth with a snap of her jaw. She was rather out of her depth here, since her knowledge on such matters was limited to what she'd researched, just in case it ever came to sharing a bed with a man, health-related information, mostly, plus whatever she'd run into in a dark corner of fan fiction world she happened to have wandered to. Since she mostly read fan fiction to Austen, Bronte, and Gaskell, all of it was quite tame. Poses and costumes Oliver could have come up with to titillate his digital Slavic toddy were hardly something Darcy or Thornton would be easy to imagine in. "Let's go find that room," Imogen muttered, her cheeks burning, and they continued their journey. Chapter 11. Bella and Aventador. Bloody hell. Bloody sodding hell. Oliver clearly had trouble coming up with anything more coherent to say. "My thoughts exactly," muttered Imogen. She'd sort of imagined a tiny closet with a shelf, which Ollie's milk jug would be sharing with some lonely China doll or something. They were currently standing in a large study, which had been renovated, its style hideously clashing with the decor of the mansion. Everything here was black and white and chrome, just as the late Mrs. Fitzroy had fancied it. One of the 3 walls had been fitted with glass door cabinetry, and behind the glass a mad assortment of most bewildering objects was presently making Imogen's head spin. Dolls, porcelain statuettes, dishes and cups, wooden carved figurines, a pair of vintage shoes, 2 African masks, a North American Aboriginal dream catcher, 5 hats hung flat on the wall, candlesticks, and, to Imogen's complete terror, one of her old drawings, a portrait of Edward Rochester as he had been imagined by the 15-year-old Mops Fox. "Bloody hell," Oliver once again choked out. Imogen gathered her will and stepped forward. "We need to find your jug." "But all these people," Oliver gestured over the cabinet. "All these poor, poor souls." "Ollie, we can't do anything now. I think someone might notice if we suddenly appear in the drawing room with our hands full of knickknacks," Imogen hissed at him. "Grab your jug, and it's time to bolt." They started examining a shelf after shelf, and Imogen's photographic memory was cataloging the items without her participation. And then she froze, while Oliver was still peering into the cabinet, almost pressing his nose to the glass. A pair of blank eyes was staring at Imogen, and she recognized the sister of the Chelsea figurine of Commedia dell'arte Harlequin, which, according to the insurance papers Imogen had filled in herself, was securely kept in a locked cabinet in Mayor Oakby's bedroom. Imogen hadn't been to the bedroom, but she'd seen the photos and also had read the description. 3 figurines, presumably a part of the original set of 5, had been in the Oakby family's possession for the last 90 years, and each of the children had received one for their 6th birthday. After Robert Oakby, the mayor's uncle, died in a car accident 12 years ago, his dottore returned into the family vault in the county bank. And here, it was clearly Deidre's Isabella who was giving Imogen a sad, knowing look. "Bloody sodding hell," Imogen exhaled, jerked the door open, and grabbed the doll. "What the hell, Imogen?" Ollie hissed. Imogen, meanwhile, was trying to stuff Isabella into her clutch. "Fox, have you lost the plot?" "I'll explain later, Oliver. Find your jug and—" "Is that your Rochester?" Oliver was clearly catching up. "Ollie." "Right, yes, the jug." The rest of the week was busy, with the Americans ever so insistent to speed up the motorway construction. And then Saturday came, and Imogen and the children, their hair brushed and clothes ironed, arrived at Mrs. Dyer's cottage. Kathy was quiet. It was her headmistress, after all. Brian kept asking about their host's sons. "Their names are Jasper and Felix. They are 12 and 9, and you will be perfectly polite with them," Imogen repeated yet again, and the boy nodded enthusiastically. "Do you think they have toys? Cars? Nexo Knights? I bet they have Nexo Knights." They did indeed. As soon as they came in, the children were whisked away by the boys, already discussing blasts and combo suits. Imogen was seated in Mrs. Dyer's immaculate drawing room. "Thank you for coming, Miss Fox," Mrs. Dyer said, after pouring them tea. "I know it's quite unusual, but the matter is somewhat personal." Imogen unconsciously threw a side glance at her own handbag, where the poor porcelain Isabella was wrapped in Imogen's best cashmere shawl. "The thing is, Imogen, as you're well aware, my brother and my father do not get along." Imogen froze with her cup lifted to her lips. It took her 2 blinks and 1 sip to catch up with this unexpected turn of the conversation. "I've had a conversation with my father," the headmistress continued, "and he expressed certain concerns regarding the contract with the Americans for that bypass that Tommy is planning to build. But of course, Tommy would never listen to Dad." Mrs. Dyer sighed. "That feud of theirs, I feel, will never be resolved. But you have to believe me, my father's opinion should be taken into consideration. He had been on the city council for 14 years before he retired." Imogen did think of reminding the headmistress that the said council had consulted the appropriate experts before even considering the Americans' offer, but then she chose against it. Imogen did always think that listening was a preferable option to answering right away. "So, I was wondering if you perhaps would pay him a visit, just for an informal chat," the headmistress asked, throwing Imogen a meaningful look over the rim of her cup. "Of course, bringing any papers to him would be a betrayal of Tommy's confidence," the headmistress continued, "but a cup of tea in the Oakby mansion would surely be forgiven if he ever were to find out about it." The woman smiled softly, but Imogen didn't return the smile because she suddenly had a distinct feeling that it most likely wouldn't be forgiven at all. In the 3 years she'd been the mayor's assistant, nothing remotely outside their professional work had been between them, but Imogen loved to think she knew the man underneath the suit. No puns or hopes intended. A cup of tea with John Thomas Alistair Oakby, Esquire, and especially an informal chat about town hall matters would perhaps not offend the mayor, but Tommy would never trust Imogen again. All she could do in the present situation was to take a sip of her tea. The headmistress continued unnecessarily reminding Imogen about Mr. Oakby Senior's accomplishments as a barrister and as a former member of the town planning committee, while Imogen nodded and pondered what she was to do with poor Isabella now. The conversation concluded, slightly awkward, since Imogen couldn't give Mrs. Dyer any other answer but that she would certainly think about it and do her best. They then stepped out into the garden, where the children and a sitter were playing with a large army of brightly colored Lego people. "Imogie, Nexo Knights!" Brian shouted and ran up to her. He shoved something green and pokey into her face after she bent down to him. "Lovely," Imogen answered awkwardly. "Well, it's time to say goodbye, and no," a choir of distressed children voices hollered back. "We aren't done. We're under attack. We need to finish the war. Mother, could they stay for a bit longer?" The headmistress' children, Imogen always thought, were quite perfect. One blonde, another dark-haired. The boys were simply beautiful, had intelligent faces and wonderful manners. The younger one looked very much like his mother, and his uncle, while his elder brother was the copy of his father, the late Mr. Dyer, a prominent mystery writer, sadly lost to cancer 5 years ago. "Perhaps the children could play some more together," Mrs. Dyer offered. No, we wouldn't want to intrude, and we have shopping to do." Imogen was indeed quite a poor liar. "Could they come next week then?" Jasper, the older one, asked, and 4 pairs of hopeful eyes fixed themselves on Imogen. She gave them a plastic smile. "We shall see," she answered. She threw a sad look at her children's handed-down clothes and old shoes and reminded herself that they were yet too young to understand what social standing was and how out of the ordinary, never to be repeated, this playdate had been. "I will give Imogen a ring during the week, and we shall see what can be arranged," the headmistress answered. Imogen felt a prickle of irritation. Giving her ducklings a false hope was quite cruel. Goodbyes were said, and Imogen and the children headed for the bus stop. During the ride, Brian fell asleep, and Kathy just wouldn't stop talking about Jasper. He was her age, and she was clearly quite smitten. She'd been given the best knight to play, she said, and then she'd become the king, and they all had listened to her, and she had the best sword, and how wonderful it had been to play with boys. And Aunt Imogen promised not to be upset, but they gave us some of their toys to take home. Kathy added in a small voice, and Imogen whipped her head. What? Yeah, Brian has a few Lego people in his pocket, and I chose this. Kathy opened a sweaty little hand and showed Imogen a small yellow car. It's a Lamborghini. Jasper said it's his favorite car. Imogen opened her mouth, but Kathy didn't let her speak. Please, Aunt Imogen, don't make us return them. The girl's eyes filled with tears. Jasper said they have plenty. And he wanted me to have this one, and Brian has no Legos, and other boys in the park laugh at him, and Imogen's throat suddenly felt painfully tight, and she sharply inhaled, trying not to start bawling. You can keep the toys, she choked out, and quickly looked away to hide her face. Are you angry, Aunt Imogen? Kathy whispered. No, I'm not. Imogen blinked purposefully, took her facial expression under control, and turned to the girl with a small smile. Of course I'm not. They're your friends, and that's their toys, so if they gave them to you, it's between you. She quickly leaned in and kissed Kathy's temple. The girl squinted like a happy cat, and Imogen made a mental note to show affection for the children more openly. Lord knew they weren't getting any. And it is an ace car, she added. The two of them spent the rest of the bus ride reading up on the model in Imogen's new mobile. Chapter 12. The Dinner. As a thank you for the minor criminal offense the two of them had committed together, Oliver offered to have the children over at his place for one night. Imogen, who had been feeling dreadful about canceling on Andrew for so long, jumped at the opportunity. She texted the policeman, and after a short exchange of their schedules, an evening was chosen. Imogen got to work. She knew his tastes, and by 9 the dinner of marinated lamb popsicles with fenugreek curry, 3 side dishes, and homemade nyan was ready and served. The first suspicion that Andrew had quite misconstrued her invitation came at the view of a small bouquet of her favorite red carnations in his hand. The button-up he had clearly changed into out of his work suit was sign number 2. Imogen escaped to the kitchen, clutching the flowers, her mind thrashing in panic. That was truly the first time in her life she'd been on the receiving end of romantic attention, or assumed she was. She still had a minuscule doubt she was the one misconstruing when Andrew leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek, making her hug the vase with the flowers unnecessarily tightly. Imogen's oversized brain went through frantic 7-step analysis of the current situation, which included but wasn't limited to 3 out 5 steps of grief, and she decided that, firstly, there was still a chance there had been no misunderstanding, and it was just a dinner between platonically attached childhood friends, and secondly, if it weren't, why wouldn't she just enjoy the dinner and see where it went? It's not as if she were in any sort of a monogamous or otherwise relationship. Andrew, unlike his usual plopping on her sofa and grabbing whatever book she had lying around, was now awkwardly standing in the middle of her drawing room. The dinner's in the kitchen, Imogen told him from the door, and he turned sharply. Oh, sure. You don't have a dining table? He then bit his tongue and frowned. Nope, and I've never had any. Seeing someone else blathering and making a bit of a fool out of themselves felt almost nice, and Imogen smiled at him. Come on, you clot. The lamb's getting cold. The food put them both at ease, and 10 minutes later they were chin-wagging just as comfortably as usual. She told him of the nutters they had to face every day at work. He told her of their new sergeant. After the meal, they moved to the drawing room with the tea tray. They were sitting in front of each other on the aforementioned sofa, and it felt nice and warm and easy. Imogen had quite forgotten by then that in Andrew's mind the dinner might have been a date, and her thoughts jumped onto the matter that preoccupied her most these days. So, what is your DI thinking about Mrs. Fitzroy? She asked greedily, while Andrew was busy cutting himself another slice of the walnut tart. You know I can't discuss it, Mops. Andrew licked the filling off his finger and picked up the plate and the fork. Andrew, I'd really appreciate if you did, she said softly, and he looked up at her. Imogen sighed. I'll be honest with you. I thought it was Oliver, that he had had something to do with her death. Just for a second, mind you. Once I stopped being mental, I immediately remembered that he wouldn't harm a fly, but... And then there's the question of the state of the road and how it should have been repaired eons ago. And then Balanson said it was poisoning. Yeah, with the diet pills. Andrew sent a forkful of the pudding in his mouth. So, does Balanson know who did it? It's just such a dreadful thought that someone we know might have had something to do with it. Andrew stuffed more tart into his mouth, and Imogen, figuratively speaking, smelled blood. Andrew, the policeman chewed. Imogen drilled into him with her eyes. Since he wasn't budging, Imogen scooted closer to him and touched his upper arm. Andrew. He violently shook his head, one of his cheek full of food. Imogen felt suddenly terrified. Blimey, is Balanson still suspecting me? Andrew quickly swallowed the dessert. No, he doesn't. It's just what? Imogen shifted even closer to him. Mops, don't torture me. Andrew's eyebrows formed a funny line sloping outwards. Andrew, is he still thinking I poisoned her? No, but we traced the drugs, Andrew blurted out. We found out who purchased them, and I know how much you appreciate your job, and the Oakbys... Imogen's heart skipped a beat. Oh no. Imogen applied all her will not to rush to her bedroom, where poor porcelain Isabella was stuffed in a drawer under Imogen's knickers. Yes, but Imogen, it really doesn't mean anything. The mayor told us he wasn't even sure where his visa was. Imogen's teeth, she'd been pretending to drink from an empty cup, screeched on the rim. What? Her eyes boggled at Andrew. Are you saying it was purchased from his card? Yes, but you aren't supposed to know it. Andrew leaned to Imogen. I'm only telling this to you because you're my friend, and I'm 100% sure neither you nor the mayor had anything to do with it. Of course we didn't. Imogen had trouble breathing. And his card is in my handbag. He always leaves it lying around, and he gives it to anyone who works with him, to get coffee and lunch and... Mops! He said he'd lost it. Of course he did. He'd lose some vital organs if they weren't neatly packed inside of him. Imogen scoffed. He loses everything all the time, except for work papers, of course. You'll have to let Balanson know you have it, but wait till the official questioning until he asks you himself. Slight blush touched Andrew's cheeks. I wasn't supposed to tell you this. Sure. But Andrew, anyone could have taken it and copied the information and used it. Anyone who has access to the town hall. Andrew nodded. And where were they drugs delivered? She asked. Mops, could we talk about something else? Andrew begged. No, wait, it really doesn't matter how they were bought, but the killer had to get them somehow, right? Where were they delivered? I'm sure you can find that out. We have. Andrew seemed to have given in to his fate. They were mailed to Abernathy and picked up by a woman. The post clerk remembered it was a woman, middle-aged, average-looking, but no details. So our killer is a woman? Andrew gave out a short, soft laugh. Our killer, Mops? Well, maybe if I help you out a bit, you'll catch her quicker, and the mayor and myself will be under no suspicion anymore? She offered shyly. I doubt you can be described as an average-looking middle-aged woman, but maybe if it were your accomplice that picked up the drugs. Andrew emitted an exaggerated pensive hum. You're taking the mickey, right? Imogen asked, giving him a suspicious look, and he laughed again. Andrew, of course I'm taking the mickey. I think snapping and coming to Mrs. Fitzroy's house and yelling at her would be more your style than adding triple dosage of diet pills into chocolate sponge cake. Is that where they were? Imogen whispered, and he nodded conspiratorially. He now seemed to be enjoying the discussion. They were sitting on the sofa, facing each other. He was leaning sideways onto the back, relaxed and smiling slightly, while Imogen tucked her feet under herself and pressed a cushion on her chest. There was an unmarked box with a sponge cake in the car. Nothing else in the house was poisoned, and it's really odd because she didn't seem like the cake-eating type, you know. Andrew shrugged. She was fit and was known for healthy eating habits. More like known for starving herself, to be honest. Imogen cringed, feeling somewhat disgusted by her own gossiping. She was very concerned with her figure, and she was loud about it. The things she'd been known to say to those whom she saw eating anything but salad. Imogen shook her head. Ollie said she once called a different teacher a gluttonous pig behind their back because she'd seen them eat chips. Whoever spiked the cake knew she'd eat it, though, Andrew noted. Take it, eat it, and not share it with anyone, unless the murderer was fine with killing a couple of her family members as well. Imogen felt sick at the thought and shook her head again. That's so awful. She truly didn't want to talk about it anymore, especially considering that the murderer was looking increasingly like a certain headmistress who had every possible opportunity to take the mayor's card and knew the victim well enough to plan the murder while avoiding casualties. Mops, Andrew called her softly, and she lifted her eyes at him. The expression on his handsome face was unfamiliar, warm and soft. His cheekbones were flushed, and then she saw his lips twitch, and that was when she noticed that they sat so close that their knees almost touched, and that his hand on the back of the sofa was half an inch away from her shoulder. His long fingers twitched, and Imogen realized that was the moment of truth. She could give it a try, she thought. They knew each other well, and they liked each other. Maybe, once they kissed, she'd suddenly see that it had been him the whole time. Him, and not the man who had zero interest in her, and who at best noticed her as a very efficient employee. Andrew's lashes fluttered, and very slowly he started leaning in. The loud, low hum of materializing TARDIS, her ringtone, cut through the silence in the room, and Imogen winced away from Andrew. I need to take this. She cleared her throat and jumped up to her feet. It might be Rosie or Ollie. He's looking after the little uns. Of course. Andrew sounded very raspy as well. Imogen looked at her mobile. It's the mayor, she said in astonishment. He never rang her outside working hours. The mayor. Andrew's voice was no less surprised and noticeably dischuffed. Hello? Imogen's heart was drumming in her chest. Miss Imogen, I need your help. The mayor sounded odd. Mr. Oakby? I need you to come. I'm in the tunnel, locked in. Oh no, Imogen breathed out and rushed to the parlor. I'll be there as soon as I can, she shouted into the mobile and then turned back to her drawing room. Andrew, I need to go. Lock the door after yourself. She was already rushing outside, blindly battering the shelf by the door to get the keys, while making comforting remarks into the mobile. It's all right. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes. And breathe. Imogen. The mayor groaned into the phone. It's all right. I'll be there very, very soon. Just breathe. The mayor was acutely claustrophobic. Chapter 13. Bring It to Light. Imogen was paddling through the dark streets of Fleckney Woulds, her heart thrashing in her throat. Thankfully, the grumpy and quite good-looking Welshman named Jones, whom the mayor had suggested to Imogen as a bike expert, had put lights on Imogen's rejuvenated machine. Otherwise, she would be in danger of her usual bicycle-related calamity to befall her. Imogen swirled and swooshed into the bushes near the tunnel exit, jumped off her bike, managing to scrape only one leg, which in her case was a significant accomplishment, and started shaking her multiple keys, looking for the right one, with a loud jiggle. The tunnel was dark and she rushed inside. She was lighting her path with her mobile, and after 2 turns she was finally on the last stretch, just by the door that led to the town hall library. There, near the floor, she could see a glimmer of another phone, presumably the mayor's. Imogen had a daft thought that this phone had never in its digital life been that close to the ground. The mayor was sitting on the floor, folded in a surprisingly compact ball. His knees were pulled to his nose. Imogen dropped on her knees in front of him. Mr. Oakby. She could see the frantically widened eyes and could hear the ragged breathing. The door. I don't have a key. "It's okay, I'll open it, in a mo. You just have to move away from it. It opens inwards." She saw the mayor shake his head jerkily. He shifted, and suddenly a hot, large hand grabbed Imogen's knee. The fingers of the second hand locked around her upper arm. Imogen decided not to take it personally. "Mr. Oakby." Suddenly his arms went around her, and Imogen was squeezed so tightly that she now knew how a toothpaste tube felt. The long nose pressed into the top of her head, and Imogen was plastered on his wide chest. Imogen commanded herself to ignore the muscles she felt through the soft tea, but to catalog the experiences for further processing, of course. And she pressed her hands into his sides and pushed. "John, I need you to move away from the door," she said in a firm tone. The mayor jolted but seemed to be somewhat responsive. Come on, just a smidge," Imogen continued. "That's good. Just scoot a bit." The mayor was heavy. A somewhat resisting mayor was immovable. Muttering and stroking his upper arm, Imogen finally persuaded him to crawl couple feet, which was a task in its own since he was refusing to release more than one of her hands. And every time she tried to untangle, he'd wrap around her like an octopus. Finally, the mayor was relocated. He was now kneeling in front of her, his arms around her middle. Once again, that was to be recorded in her photographic memory and put aside for now, and she stretched and unlocked the door. It opened, the light rushed in, and the mayor lunged out of the tunnel. Surprisingly, pulling Imogen with him. She'd expected to be abandoned as soon as the trap was opened. They fell on the floor of the library, and Imogen once again gasped in shock when the mayor scooped her in his arms and pressed her into him. He was once again snuffling into her hair, and against her will she hugged him back. He was shaking. "It's all right. It's all right. You're out," she muttered, and gingerly stroked the back of his head. The hair was wet, soft semi-curls sticking up on his nape. She just noticed that the mayor was dressed in PJ bottoms, soft fluffy socks, and an old tee. Most likely he'd just taken a shower when he was incarcerated in the tunnel. "They pushed me in. There was some noise and I looked in. The door was open. I had no key." Another shudder ran through his body. "And no torch. I'm so sorry, but it's okay now." Imogen rubbed him between his shoulder blades. "Thank you," he whispered. Imogen emitted an awkward chuckle. The urgency of the situation was now going down, and she was now fully aware she was half sitting on the floor in the mayor's arms. "Anyone would do the same," she said in a forced light tone. "Others help less," he mumbled, and finally moved away. Imogen exhaled a shaky breath. The mayor's face was right in front of her. The bright blue eyes and the nose Imogen was marginally fixated on. And then he dove in and pressed his lips to hers. His lips were warm and soft. After a second of hesitation, Imogen leaned in and then moved closer, and then a bit closer again. The first school children kiss was now quickly turning into a very much adult copping off. At least so it seemed to the properly inexperienced Imogen. The mayor's lips parted softly, and then he deepened the kiss, and his palm lay on her jaw, angling her face. Imogen was hardly passive as well. It was after all she who'd climbed on the man's lap and was currently pulling him closer and closer by his neck. The mayor was the one who decided they needed a break. If Imogen could think, she couldn't. She'd say she didn't support the notion. The mayor moved away and looked into her eyes. She could bet she looked cross-eyed and endlessly pleased. The mayor cleared his throat and gave her one of his usual inquiring looks. This one was his habitual request for her opinion on an ambiguous social situation. "We need to check what was taken and call the police," Imogen offered, and he exhaled in relief. "Was this because of the tunnel?" she blurted out, and the mayor under her tensed. Perhaps the question was childish, but Imogen had never had a copping-off session before. She wasn't sure what the rules of the engagement were, and she was also properly curious. Imogen studied the man's face. To think of it, he didn't look uncomfortable, just pensive. "No, I don't think so," he finally answered and met her eyes again. "It's sort of Accumulated recently and got released under stress. Oh, answered Imogen inarticulately. We should check if there are any burglars in the house. They'd already left, probably. It's been a while, the mayor noted while Imogen was climbing off his lap. Still, should you maybe go and fetch your cricket bat? Imogen asked and took a step closer to him. He was large and, as it turned out, warm, and she was considering hiding behind him. If it makes you feel better, he answered in his normal, confident voice, and Imogen immediately felt better. They checked the office and his living space, but nothing seemed to have been taken. Meanwhile, Imogen rang up the police station and then Andrew. She considered leaving into a different room during this call, while the mayor was checking his laptop and the safe in his study. But now, in the empty house, and with a cricket bat in his hand, he was the savior, and she was the one who'd rather not wander off. Her discomfort at how rude she'd been towards Andrew had to wait. Andrew, I'm at the mayor's house, and there's been a break-in. I've called the station already, but... Are you all right, Mops? Andrew hollered, and Imogen jerked the mobile away from her ear. Yes, I'm all right. She sneaked a peek at the mayor, who was kneeling in front of his safe. We're going through the list of valuables right now, and Mr. Oakby... She didn't get to finish. I'm on my way. Andrew barked into the phone and hung up. He was always strictly against being on the phone while driving. Imogen sighed, stuffed the phone in the pocket of her best skirt, and once again edged towards the mayor. Was that Cooper? The mayor asked, and Imogen gawked at him. She wasn't aware he knew Andrew's first name, or was familiar with Imogen's circle of friends altogether. Yeah, we were having dinner, when you rang. That's quite a late dinner, the mayor said offhandedly. Answered Imogen, utterly confused by his remark. Nothing seems to have been touched. The mayor got up and looked down at himself. The PJ bottoms were dirty, and he wiped his hands on the tartan flannel on his hips. I should go change. Imogen nodded and followed him towards the staircase leading up to his residence. She wasn't going to his bedroom, of course, but she'd rather not stay alone in an empty floor. You can wait in the kitchen, he offered. Imogen thanked him and minced there. The kettle hadn't boiled yet when, as they say, the cavalry arrived. The officers filled the town halls and the mayor joined Imogen in the kitchen. Ballinson and Andrew were already there. So, tell us what happened, Mr. Oakby. Ballinson started softly. Chapter 14. Aftermath and the Unpleasant Analysis. I was reading upstairs in the drawing room when I heard some noise, the mayor started. I assumed it was Imogen. I mean, Miss Fox. He threw her a quick look, since the noise was coming from the secret tunnel. Secret tunnel? Ballinson asked, and Andrew looked up from the notebook he was scribbling in. The mayor looked at Imogen again, and she gave him a tiny shrug. Yes, this house has a secret tunnel that leads out into the moors. It's a strictly need-to-know matter. Only the official employees of the town hall are aware, and we've all signed a non-disclosure agreement. It couldn't have been Mops. She was having dinner with me, Andrew exclaimed, and Imogen gave him an exasperated look. Who's Mops? The mayor asked, confused. Why would it be me? Imogen said at the same time. There's no point for anyone who works here, namely myself or Mrs. Harris, to break in the middle of the night if we can just walk in during normal hours. She then turned to the mayor. I am Mops. It's a childhood nickname. Like a dog. The mayor made a series of his habitual small blinks, which meant his brain was processing. A pug? Imogen offered another explanation. He continued staring at her, still clearly baffled. Because of my eyes, you know, she said. For some reason, the other two men continued standing in silence, letting Imogen and the mayor have this discussion, given it was somewhat one-sided since the mayor was still just parroting her words. Like a pug? The mayor asked. Imogen nodded. I don't see it, he deadpanned. But they are like that. Imogen pointed at her face and gestured in circular movement around her eyes. Big, buggy eyes. "I always thought you looked more like a lynx," the mayor said offhandedly and turned to the DI. "I went down the stairs and saw that the door was open. I looked in, leaned in, and then they pushed me inside and closed the door behind me. Imogen wasn't listening. Imogen was dead. And in heaven. He said she looked like a lynx, a sleek, beautiful, wild feline, and not a wrinkly, marginally adorable, but more of an acquired taste pooch. Nothing of value had been taken, Imogen said, returning to reality, with obvious difficulty, neither Mr. Oakby's devices nor the office safe. "So, let me take you through what happened again," Ballinson said. "Someone who knew of the secret tunnel—" "Myself, Miss Fox, or Mrs. Harris," the mayor interrupted. "And no one else?" Ballinson squinted doubtfully. "What about previous employees of the town hall, the previous generation?" "I'm the first directly elected mayor of the town, Inspector. Previously, when the town council was in charge, the tunnel had been locked and unused. According to the paperwork, after its discovery in 1962, the secret was known only to the vicar of All Saints Church, passed on to their successors, and then I was bestowed with it when I moved into the building. So we have 3 vicars, whoever they had shared the secret with. Yourself, Miss Fox, and Mrs. Harris, then?" the inspector asked. "And Mrs. Roberts, the cleaning lady," Imogen blurted out, and all 3 men looked at her. "I mean, she's a cleaning lady," Imogen exclaimed. "They always know all secrets of a household. Given again, why would she sneak in the middle of the night? She can just wait till Tuesday for her usual day and come and take whatever it was she needed." "Perhaps it was urgent. Something that couldn't wait," Andrew drew out, looking down at his notes again. "Like what?" Imogen asked, but received no answer. "Well, all right." Ballinson shook his head. "Tomorrow, please, examine the papers and the valuables again to make sure nothing's missing. Lock the tunnel and please install a proper alarm on it, just like on the front doors." He gave the mayor a pointed, good-natured look, and the mayor nodded curtly. "We will leave you to it, then." "To what?" the mayor asked sharply. Ballinson gave him a long look, his eyes twinkling, and then with polite goodbyes, he headed out of the kitchen. "Mops! Imogen, could I have a word with you?" Andrew's voice was tense. Imogen excused herself and followed Andrew into the mayor's drawing room. His well-postured, wide-shouldered self looked even taller and more rigid now. "What's up, Andrew?" she asked in a fake cheery tone. "Would you like a lift home?" he asked, slowly turning to her. "Or you're staying?" She gawked at him. "Staying? Why would I stay? It's almost midnight." "Because the mayor's wearing your lipstick." Usually, Imogen's brain felt like a squirrel, fast, twitchy, and barmy. At the moment, she felt that, metaphorically speaking, her skull contained a sloth. The sloth said, "What?" and fell asleep. "I'll take my bike," Imogen squeaked and cowardly shifted her eyes. Andrew was silent for a few seconds, and then with a quiet, "All right then," he was gone. Imogen's sloth brain was still snoring when the mayor's voice came from the kitchen. "Miss Fox, your tea's ready." Imogen's right eye twitched. She sighed and dragged herself to drink the damn tea. The next day, after 4 hours of thorough search of the town hall, it was finally time for a break. Imogen biked to the town center, dropped herself in a comfortable chair in Mrs. Barnett's tea rooms, in a secluded corner, ordered her food, and rang up Oliver. When she'd picked up the children in Oliver's flat in the morning, she was too knackered to have any sort of a discussion. She checked her watch to make sure that she was indeed going to catch Oliver while he was habitually smoking, hiding in the bushes behind the school. "So, how was the date last night?" Oliver asked. "Oh, bugger," Imogen muttered. "So apparently I'm the only one who didn't get the memo." Oliver laughed. "The memo that it was a date? I reckoned you didn't. All that talk about what a great mate your Sergeant Sexy is and how you can't fathom why he's still single." Imogen groaned. "Is he still single?" Oliver drew out cheekily. To the best of my knowledge, Imogen answered with a fair share of sarcasm in her voice. What? What's wrong with you, Mops? You invite a bloke over, cook him dinner, have the house all to yourself, and nothing. Well, there was sort of a moment there when it seemed like something, Mops muttered. Goodness, Mops, you're a hopeless cow. Imogen felt somewhat hurt by the flippant attitude and placed her fatal blow, and then the mayor kissed me. The sounds on the other end led Imogen to believe that she might have just killed her best friend. Oliver, are you all right? She asked with worry, hearing him coughing, hissing, and whizzing. What the bloody hell, Mops? Oliver burst into another series of choked sounds. The mayor. Yeah, there was an urgent matter. She decided disclosing the break-in would be unprofessional, to say nothing of telling Oliver about the mayor's curling into a ball in a bout of claustrophobia and then clinging to Imogen like batter to a slice of fish. And I had to go into the office, and he kissed me, or I kissed him. We kissed. Her cheeks suddenly felt hot. A lot. There was a lot of kissing. Oh, my bleeping God. Imogen rolled her eyes at the sound of Oliver's overdramatics. How was it? Was it good? Does he know what he's doing? Oh, what am I asking? It's not like you have anything to compare it to. But Imogen, the mayor, John Bleeding Oakby, the mayor. Imogen felt like the 13th Doctor doing the bigger on the inside speech. After all, that was exactly the reaction one would want to receive when sharing the news of such magnitude. Tell me it was good for you, Mops. It was magical, Imogen sing-songed, and he said he thought my eyes looked like the eyes of a lynx. Sod off, Mops, you're taking the piss. No, way, in hell. Oliver choked on his squeaking and continued to loudly hyperventilate on the other end. I'm 100% honest, and you know what? Oh, bloody hell, there's more? Oliver groaned. That's not a good thing, though, Imogen said. He said it in front of Andrew. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Oliver? Shush, I'm savoring the mental image. Oliver made a few odd noises at the background. You do realize that your mayor, your supposedly asexual, unaware mayor, is just a man of flesh and blood now, and he was jealous and basically staked his claim on you. Imogen stopped chewing her sarnie, thought about it, and shook her head. Don't be daft, Ollie. Of course he wasn't jealous. I don't think it had even registered in his head that Andrew and I had had dinner. Imogen stopped and remembered the "that's quite a late dinner" the mayor had given her regarding her alibi for the time of the break-in. Somehow, the thought just cheapened the overall experience for her, and she pushed the plate away from her. Do you think he was jealous? She asked in a miserable voice. Totally. He went all Neanderthal and... Roar! Oliver answered gleefully. Ollie, I have to go, Imogen mumbled and started looking for her wallet. My break is over. So yeah, here's the latest news. Mops, I'm so coming over tonight with a bottle of Shiraz, and we're discussing every little detail of that kiss. Oliver was still blabbering something in the background, but Imogen hurriedly said her goodbyes and hung up. During her bike ride back, she felt gloomy. She knew so little about men. What if Oliver was right and the kiss wasn't about how ace it felt to be so close, and not him feeling she was special and helping more than other? And the lynx comment wasn't about her eyes per se, but an attempt to emphasize that he was somehow better than Andrew, who had stuck with the childhood nickname she'd hated so much. She parked the bike and dragged her sorry self inside. The mayor was loudly talking on the phone in his office, and Imogen stuck her tongue at the door, and then had to snap her mouth shut since the aforementioned door swung open and the wide-shouldered, disheveled, and so very delicious mayor himself rushed towards her, seemingly surrounded by the hurricane of papers. Chapter 15. No More Kisses. The Americans are coming next week, the mayor muttered. It seemed to Imogen that the papers were fluttering around him as if he were a Potterverse character. In the morning, Imogen had jotted down a small to-do list for herself, 23 points, and she picked up her sonic screwdriver-shaped pen, while the mayor started in his habitual machine gun manner. The Americans coming thus: tickets, accommodations, food, welcome packages for the welcome due, papers, reservations for a celebratory reception. Tick, 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 went Imogen's pen in her daybook. The moors, the benches, the arboretum, the fate to celebrate. 4 more ticks followed. The road constructions in 3 locations around the town. Tick. His sister's birthday. No tick followed. Imogen had taken care of the present the day before. Ms. Sanders' pre-sale renovations permit. Tick. Bits and bobs of the official town nature followed, and Imogen finally looked down at the page, tearing her eyes off the mayor with difficulty. The mayor had hit 22 out of 23. Only suit fitting was left unticked. If not for Imogen, the mayor would generally go around his day quite unattired, and not in a good way. Just this morning she'd caught him by the tie while he was snatching a scone for his morning cuppa, and his balthus had been put in order. Not to be misunderstood, Imogen could hardly claim she disliked this part of her job. Among other things, the mayor had a habit of sticking his left hand into his mane and ruffling it. He always finished that gesture with a strange twist of his wrist, fingers threaded in the soft curls, which would give him a hoopoe tuft behind his left ear. The mayor had been sufficiently trained by now and would bend as soon as the brush, specifically kept in her desk for the unhoopoing, would pop into Imogen's hand. Imogen assured the mayor that they were on the same page. He nodded, still looking into the papers in his hand, and turned around to leave. Imogen had already stretched her hand to her phone to start on her 22 tasks, and to reschedule the suit fitting, when the mayor's voice made her look up at him. "Where are we with the break-in?" "The alarm firm is sending someone to look at the tunnel doors today. I've checked the papers and the valuables, including art, again this morning. Nothing seems to have been touched." The mayor hummed. Imogen swooned, and then he stuck his hand into his hair. He had no meetings planned for the rest of the day, and Imogen decided to pass up the brush. She'd get understandably titillated when brushing the mayor's dark brown tresses. But on the other hand, the brush grabbing felt strangely similar to her spritzing her cat from a spray bottle. The poor man soon would start expecting a biscuit after being such a good boy and standing still. "The only place I haven't looked at is the cellar," Imogen added, and the mayor's blue eyes lost a distant look, and he tilted his head questioningly. "You know, the one where we keep the pre-computer era archive?" she added. "I can't imagine anyone taking anything from there, but I'm planning to check it at the end of the day. We have quite a poor catalog system for it," the mayor grumbled. "Yeah, but we have this," Imogen said pointedly and tapped her finger to her temple. "Photographic memory, remember?" The mayor stared at her forehead, and Imogen giggled. His multiple times aforementioned silky, heavy strands, and his shoulders and his waist, and his long, strong legs, and his gorgeous hands, and anything and everything about his appearance, and all his adorable habits, and his charming quirks and idiosyncrasies, say, how he picked up his cup with the thumb and the middle finger, as if covering it with his palm, and then drank, turning and tilting his hand. Or everything else about the man, for that matter, might have flustered Imogen and made her desperately loved up. But when it came to work, Imogen knew who was, quoting the 11th Doctor, "Da man." "I familiarized myself with the archive when I started working for you. I won't remember every document in it, of course, but if something was removed, I might be able to guess what," she finished confidently. The mayor blinked. "Just don't stay overtime, please," he said, tousling more curls behind his left ear. Imogen nodded with a smile. "I don't pay you enough," he suddenly muttered. "You've just given me a raise," Imogen reminded him. He studied her for a second, and then stretched his hand and put something on her table. And then he turned around and disappeared in his office, once again rustling with his papers. Imogen stared at a small cone-shaped metal object on her table, and then she realized it was a Hershey's Kiss sweet. Holding her breath, Imogen touched the tip of her index finger to the end of the paper plume, jollily sticking up out of the foil pyramid. Contrary to Imogen's expectations, the treat wasn't a hallucination. By the time she was supposed to go home, Imogen managed a third of the archive. Sneezing and coughing, she went up the stairs, back into the house. The office had been locked, and the mayor was nowhere to be seen. Imogen picked up her handbag and headed out. While she was pedaling home, Imogen's mind jumped between two quandaries she seemed to be most preoccupied these days. The question of the mayor's kisses, which was now a pun Imogen hadn't intended, had been stuffed at the back of her mind. She might have been love-stricken, but Imogen Fox knew when to put the labors lost of her daft heart aside. Firstly, it was unclear what to do with the mayor's father's presumable negative insight into the contract with the Americans. Imogen could, cataloging the options from least comfortable to those Imogen's aforementioned daft heart demanded most, meet up with Mr. Oakby, the older and the scarier, without informing his son. Alternatively, she could go for the cuppa and then tell the mayor if whatever she found out rang true and important to her. Or she could share Mrs. Dyer's concerns with the mayor and discuss the potentiality of hearing out what the older man had to say. The second issue drilling into Imogen's temple had to do with the china statuette hidden under her bed. Imogen was a longtime close friend of a policeman. She knew she had perverted the course of justice by contaminating the crime scene. Imogen's bike whirred. She'd quite forgotten about the said policeman, hadn't she? And just as the past turbulent 13 hours, had it really been that little? When Imogen's private life suddenly became, put simply, existent, she once again lamented the lack of a coherent manual to romance that humans surely should have developed long ago. Imogen sighed, pushing her pedals industriously. Nothing seemed to have happened to think of it. One man had sat on her sofa and leaned ahead, potentially aiming for a kiss. Another one had kissed her. She'd kissed him. They'd kissed, damn it. Despite all these thoughts about kisses, and damn the mayor's unexpected gesture, which brought more kisses into the equation, in reality, there had been one kiss, and it had no continuation. Meanwhile, the kiss that hadn't happened meant even less so. Was Imogen a silly cow? Yes. But had anything actually happened, or was she simply bedraggled by a murder, police questioning and a break-in, and just reading too much into something that other people wouldn't probably spare a thought to? Imogen huffed and puffed and told herself to concentrate on not falling into a ditch. Again. She was finally home, and she locked the bike in the shed and went inside to let the sitter go, cook dinner and think about everything and anything but kisses. It was on the second cup of her post-supper tea when the children were tucked in bed. She had only one bed in the cottage, her own, and she'd given it up to the little uns, when Imogen emitted a triumphant, "Ha!" The file that was missing from the cabinet she'd looked through several hours ago contained the list of the buildings of the Fleckney Woulds that fell under the planning, listed buildings and conservation areas, Amendment No. 2, England Regulations 2009, as well as the accompanying documentation, namely the wills and the contracts restricting the renovations and sale of the 5 listed houses in the heart of the town. Imogen jumped to her feet, not even knowing where to rush and what to do, and then froze, her unseeing eyes fixed on the wall. If the 3 previous vicars of Fleckney Woulds, the only keepers of the secret of the tunnel, had never broken their oath, and if neither Mrs. Harris, the clerk, and Mrs. Roberts, the cleaning lady, had shared it either, then Imogen knew who had slipped into the town hall the night before and pushed the mayor into the darkness of doom, which then led to the kiss. But that hardly mattered, damn it. Imogen scolded her silly old self. Out of the 5 historic houses protected by the Conservation Act, only one was of importance to Imogen right now. That would be No. 6 Oak Road, the location of Ms. Sanders' bookshop, which Imogen loved so much, the bookshop that had been failing financially in the last few years, and which Ms. Sanders, a perpetually suffering from a mild cold spinster, was looking into selling, and the permit for pre-sale renovations of which the mayor had approved this very morning. Miss Sanders, whose mother was in charge of the pillboxes in the countryside around the town during the war, and who'd done the presentation on the wartime Fleckney Woulds at Imogen's school many years ago. Imogen could remember sitting in the cold classroom with Oliver by her side, listening to the tiny Mrs. Sanders, with her white curls and dry little hands with age spots, telling them about the stop lines and Operation Pied Piper, and hiding the children in the old mill, and that one night when they all had to run through a priest hole out onto the moors behind the building that was now none other but the town hall. Chapter 16. Legs and Bags. Imogen was hardly prone to sudden amateur sleuthing, but she could see no other option but to go to Mrs. Sanders' shop, to, put simply, snoop around. She had no proof except that it all somehow made sense in her mind. Mrs. Sanders and her daughter wanting to sell their shop, and the papers regulating the conservation and the sale of the building where the shop was suddenly disappearing, stolen by an assailant who had to be among very few people who had any knowledge of the secret tunnel, Mrs. Sanders herself being among those few. Not to be misunderstood, Imogen had never had any problem with following the laws and conventions of the society, except breaking couple traffic rules and the incident with the porcelain Isabella, and she would have been more than happy to leave any sort of investigative efforts to the proper authorities. Except in this case, the proper authorities would be Andrew, whom she just couldn't go to with her ideas, because she felt horrible about the unfortunate interrupted dinner. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she deeply sympathized Andrew's potential frustration. She was in no way feeling guilty for kissing the mayor, right after, almost, kissing Andrew. She was an independent human being, free to kiss whoever she wanted, but she could see now that, though unintentionally, she had led Andrew to believe the dinner had been a date, and then she'd reaffirmed this illusion by the sofa incident. And then she had enthusiastically smeared her lipstick all over the mayor's lips. A shiver ran through Imogen's body at the thought of said lips, as it turned out, soft, warm, and previously seen curved in a small smile or puckered when he was savoring his cuppa, with the dark whiskers above the upper one, or the bottom one brushing at Imogen's jaw. This ridiculous daydreaming needs to be taken under control, Imogen ordered herself. She'd arrived at Mrs. Sanders' bookshop and had to focus. The bell jingled above the door. "Ah, Miss Fox, came for your Dorothy Sayers, I assume." The bleak voice of Miss Sanders came from behind the counter. Imogen gulped and stretched her mouth in a polite smile. Well, you see, Miss Sanders, I have had some unexpected expenses recently, and I was wondering if you could keep the books on hold for a while longer." Imogen conjured her most convincing begging grimace. She was a poor liar after all. Also, she did have the money, thanks to the raise she'd been so generously given by the mayor. But she assumed that Miss Sanders would be more inclined to chat with Imogen if the latter appeared vulnerable and pitiful. "But I swear, I will come for them next month." "It's your sister again, isn't it, Miss Fox?" Miss Sanders asked, looking at Imogen above the thick glasses. The woman's large, pale eyes were dull. Imogen nodded, industriously trying to look embarrassed. It wasn't that hard, she had to admit. Miss Sanders' assumption was very much based on the past after all. "Could I browse your shelves for a bit?" Imogen muttered, and received a dismissive, "Be my guest." Imogen edged towards a shelf with romance novels, since it was the closest to the counter. She pulled a random book out, and her eyes dropped on the cover. Surely the woman in the picture should be very uncomfortable, Imogen thought, looking at a maiden in the arms of a presumable Scotsman, while the man was hench, dressed solely in a kilt, and looked rather lacking in the intellectual department. The woman, in a half-open dress, was bending backwards, seemingly overcome by a dizzying spell. She certainly looked quite cross-eyed. Since there was a castle in the background and the woman's dress had a bodice and a petticoat, the book was of the historical nature. Perhaps the woman was feeling faint from the odor that was surely emanating from the Scot. After all, a bath or a shower weren't among daily habits of people at that time. The mayor, meanwhile, Imogen's brain supplied unhelpfully, smelled like vanilla. There was some sort of a cologne, something expensive, spicy, and unintrusive, but underneath, there was vanilla. Imogen had had the privilege to gather lungfuls of it while exploring the mayor's physique on the floor of the library. Imogen ordered herself to stop being a daft, enamored cow. Imogen realized she was now scrutinizing the Scot's lower half. Thankfully, the kilt was sufficiently long to cover the parts Imogen just didn't want to think about, but the picture had brought Imogen's mind onto the subject she'd never even imagined to consider, that of male legs. The Scot's legs were hairy, and muscles bulged on the calves and thighs. It's not that Imogen had never seen male legs. She hadn't been living in a nunnery. She just never actually looked. But were all male legs like that? Were the mayor's? And more importantly, why was Imogen suddenly profoundly excited at the thought that perhaps the mayor's legs were as sculpted and hairy as those of the dim-witted-looking Scot? "Would you like me to put this one aside for you as well?" Miss Sanders' tone was sarcastic, and Imogen jumped up. No. I don't read romance. Well, except for Olivia Dane, maybe." Imogen cowardly stuffed the Scot and the dizzy maiden back onto the shelf. "They are all rubbish," said Miss Sanders grumpily, as if a man would feel and do a half of what they describe there. All they do is come home, drop their backside on the sofa, and watch telly. Even at the beginning, all they want from you is a cooked meal. Miss Sanders, it was known, and of course discussed incessantly by the gossip of the town, had been once in a relationship with Mr. Buck, the organic butcher. Imogen could quite easily imagine why Miss Sanders had found the experience disappointing. Mr. Buck did strike Imogen as a backside-dropping, telly-watching type. And then Imogen thought that she wouldn't mind cooking a meal for someone if she were in a relationship. If, said someone was tired after work and sat down on the sofa and asked politely, and on any other day, said someone would make no less effort to support and accommodate Imogen. She would gladly go to the kitchen and cook the hypothetical someone's favorite spaghetti bolognese. Imogen relocated her sleuthing self to the shelf, even closer to the counter. Sadly, the books here were of even less comforting nature. The glossy spines of volumes on pregnancy and childcare made Imogen uneasily shift her weight between her feet. As loved up and generally daft as Imogen was, even she wasn't that far gone as to start imagining holding a dark-haired, blue-eyed, chubby baby that would have round cheeks and smell like vanilla. Oh, wait. Imogen decided that flipping through Cooking with Your Toddler would be least suspicious, considering the age of her nephew, and she picked up the heavy book off the wall. "Oh, by the way, Miss Sanders, your renovation permits have been signed yesterday." Imogen ventured into her snooping around in a horribly unnatural voice. Miss Sanders displayed a shocking amount of emotion on her normally blasé face. "Oh, that is lovely," Miss Sanders choked out, and peered at Imogen with her buggy eyes. There were no issues with them then. No issues at all. They have received the Preservation Committee's approval last month, and the council sent them to the mayor, and he signed them, all set to sell now. Imogen looked up at Miss Sanders from the photo of cat-shaped sarnies with eyes made of olives. The shop owner was pale, and not her usual unhealthy lifestyle pale. It was more a stressed-out paleness now. "It will be such a pity to see you sell the shop, Miss Sanders," Imogen drew out. "You've always been so generous to me, always giving me a discount and putting my books aside, although I can afford so few of them." Miss Sanders' left eye twitched behind the glasses. "You know, with my minuscule pay," Imogen continued rambling, while trying to see if Miss Sanders were to get spun out by the discussion of the sale. The answer to the question was a definite yes. I mean, I work and work, pushing all those papers around, filling all those forms in, and looking at all those regulations. Imogen was running out of things to say when suddenly Miss Sanders made a strange gurgling noise, rushed from around the counter, past Imogen, and to the shelf with the romance novels. She then jerked the volume decorated with the Scott with remarkable legs out of the row and plopped it on top of the open cookbook in Imogen's hands. "Would you like anything else?" Miss Sanders rasped out, and Imogen gave her a confused look. "I beg your pardon?" "Anything else you like here? As a gift, I mean, to our loyal customer," Miss Sanders bleated, shaking and twitching. Imogen just couldn't quite grasp what was happening. "But I don't... Perhaps one of those Sayers that you've put aside, or all 4 of them." Miss Sanders was growing hysterical, and then she jolted and flailed her arms in a strange gesture, as if pointing at 3 directions at the same time. She then lunged behind the counter again and pulled out the very 4 Lord Whimsy novels that Imogen had been hoping to bestow herself with before she'd become a primary caretaker of 2 children. The books were mercilessly shoved into a violently rustling paper bag. The Scott and the cookbook were jerked out of Imogen's hands and followed suit. "And some biscuits for the children, perhaps?" Miss Sanders offered in a high-pitched voice. Imogen found that the most alarming part of the overall bizarre experience was the strange, glassy-eyed, twisted smile on Miss Sanders' face, who looked like the character Joker from the American comic books. The bookshop had a small corner where people could have tea and biscuits and pastries that Mrs. Sanders, the mother of the currently mad-behaving woman, baked. Her baking was rather dull, but people tended to buy the sweets just to support the failing business. A box of biscuits traveled into the bag as well. It was thrust into Imogen's hands, and somehow Imogen was suddenly outside, insistently pushed out by a pair of shaking hands. The door closed behind her with a deafening bang and a mournful clank of the bell. The curtains were hastily drawn, and the sign flipped, saying a very decisive, "Closed now." Imogen blinked and then looked down into the paper bag. She could have been wrong, but it seemed that she had just accepted a bribe. Chapter 17. 3 Birds. The next morning, after a sleepless night of tossing and turning in her bed, and anxious glances towards Miss Sanders' paper bag that had been seated in the old armchair in Imogen's bedroom, and gleamed in the dark like the Canterville ghost, Imogen decisively walked into the office and marched to the mayor's door. She knocked, and he invited her in. "Mr. Oakby, I have an emergency. Could I request the second half of the day off?" He looked up at her, from some papers scattered on his table. She could understand his confusion. She'd never done anything even remotely as irregular. "Of course." He gave her a scrutinizing look. "Is there something I could do? Is it the children?" She shook her head. "It's not exactly personal, but I can't tell you what's it about. But it's important." His blue eyes were calm. "Of course, Imogen. Whatever you need." He gave her a fleeting warm smile and went back to reading. That felt amazing. Imogen told herself not to read too much into his behavior, but he said, "Whatever you need." He trusted her judgment. He didn't try to ask 100 questions or impose some help onto poor Mops, who was just too clumsy and a doormat. She picked up the paper bag from under her desk, pressed it to her chest, and walked to the bus stop. She was invited into D.I. Ballanson's office after waiting for just 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, Imogen decided to follow the example of a certain endlessly sexy gentleman. She'd always been quite sapiosexual, so what does it matter that, according to the internet, said gentleman had an otter face? And find out the features of interest in her current predicament. The feature of interest number 1 was the China Isabella, which was closely related to the second issue on Imogen's busy mental agenda. The question of Mr. Oakby Senar expecting her to accept his invitation for tea and a chat. Both of these birds were to be decisively ended in with one rock, Imogen decided. She edged into Balancen's office and shook his hand, still pressing her undesired loot to her chest with her left one. The DI pointed at the chair across his table, and Imogen tucked herself in. She took a deep breath and started on the feature of interest, numero tres. Inspector, I suspect that I might be aware of who could be involved into Mrs. Fitzroy's death. The inspector didn't express even a tinge of surprise. He simply pulled out some form from a folder on his desk and clicked with a pen. I'm listening, Miss Fox. Imogen sighed and gave him a miserable look. I have no proof, to be honest. It just all makes sense, and I normally would go to Andrew to discuss it, like I always have, but I feel he must be quite cross with me these days. The inspector's dark eyes twinkled under his snow-white, bushy eyebrows. He does seem to be rather dischuffed these days. I'd rather you not dispirit my best sergeant, Miss Fox. Imogen sighed and shifted on the chair. You see, Inspector, I have already checked, and there are no copies of those papers, so I couldn't possibly prove what exactly is missing. Imogen looked up and saw a polite but confused expression on the DI's face. Oh dear, sorry, she said. I tend to... She wiggled her fingers near her temple. Ah, yes, Cooper mentioned your mind zigzags. That stung. Imogen didn't enjoy feeling as if there were something wanting in her thinking. There are several buildings in Fleckney Woulds that are protected by the Conservation Act 2009, and their sale and renovations are additionally regulated by the wills of their previous owners. The house that's occupied by the Mrs. and Ms. Sanders bookshop is one of them. You see, they're planning to sell it and have already had the permits for pre-sale renovations approved by the mayor's office. And Mrs. Fitzroy was on the preservation committee, and actually, her branch was in charge of this exact part of the town. Imogen gasped for breath and continued, So if there were some papers that prohibited the sale of that building, and I think there were, because that's what the burglar took out of the archive that night, then Mrs. Fitzroy could have stumbled upon them and... Imogen gathered her will and breathed out, blackmailed Mrs. and Ms. Sanders. There was no answer. The inspector just serenely studied Imogen's face, and she felt blush slowly heat up her cheekbones like a crepe pan. It surely sounded like she was sticking her nose where it didn't belong, did it? Additionally, Mrs. Sanders was in charge of evacuation protocols during the war, and wouldn't she know of the tunnel then? Imogen gave the policeman a hopeful look, but no encouragement was given. Imogen coughed awkwardly. And you see, Inspector, she mumbled, I went to Miss Sanders' shop and I think she assumed, well, that I was hinting that I knew about the papers, but I wasn't. I just sort of... Imogen's nose twitched in her usual nervous tick. And she gave me this. Imogen thrust the paper bag towards the DI, and he carefully took it. He pulled out the contents and displayed them on the table. Slave to his passion. He read slowly and lifted his black cherry eyes at Imogen. Is this supposed to be a clue, Miss Fox? It's a gift, Imogen exclaimed and made vague Jack Sparrow hand movements. And there's another book, and the 4 that she'd had on hold for me, and she even gave me a box of biscuits. Imogen pointed accusatorially. Miss Sanders is known to never give any discounts or gifts. Are you telling me that slave to his passion, cooking with your toddler, 4 classic mystery novels, Jinxiao, and... He peeked in the box. About a dozen of shortbreads were Ms. Sanders' attempt to buy your silence. Well, when you put it that way, thought Imogen, and squirmed on her chair. How do you know that the papers pertaining to the sales of the building are those that were stolen? The inspector asked with sincere curiosity. I have photographic memory, Imogen grumbled back. I remember the covers of the folders in the cabinet because I'd had a look at the archive when I started working in the house. I never looked inside, though. So what did the cover say? Oak, Ash, Meyer, Ruth, wills, contracts, demolition, fire. And then the registry numbers. It's the block where the bookshop is. That's amazing. Ballinson exclaimed, and even clapped his large, square palm to the table. "Can you recite the numbers, too?" "I can, but it's confidential information," Imogen answered with dignity. The policeman laughed heartily. "You are indeed a valuable asset to the town hall, Ms. Fox." Imogen wondered if the man was being sarcastic. "Well, let's do it this way. You take the passion and the cookbook and the novels. After all, they were gifts. And leave the biscuits here." A sudden terrifying thought pierced Imogen's mind, and she gasped, "Oh, Lord, do you think they are poisoned, just like the sponge cake Mrs. Fitzroy had eaten?" Ballinson laughed even louder. "I should have a serious conversation with my sergeant about disclosing confidential information to the persons of interest in an investigation." Imogen clasped her hand over her mouth and stared at the inspector. "And no, I don't think they are poisoned," he added merrily, "but it's never a waste of time to check. If anything, our force will have it with their tea. What do you think?" Imogen spasmodically nodded without lowering her hand. "Thank you for your vigilance, Ms. Fox." He smiled at her pleasantly, and Imogen bleated thank yous and goodbyes and fled. The conversation had left her quite unsatisfied, and she was mulling it over while waiting for the bus that would take her to the Fleckney Woulds Comprehensive. On one hand, Ballinson didn't tell her directly that she was a meddling cow, but neither had he taken any official statement from her. Imogen had watched him. He hadn't written anything down. And there was still the question of that strange amusement he'd shown when asking her what was written on the cover, as if testing the aforementioned photographic memory of hers, as if already knowing the right answer. On the bus, Imogen continued thinking her somber thoughts, and upon arriving at the school, she headed to the administrative offices. Once again, she was asked to wait, this time in front of the headmistress door, and the memories of her own school days returned. She'd ever been asked into this room for any of her own transgressions, since she'd had close to none, but sometimes Ollie or Andrew would get her into trouble. There was also that time when she'd gotten in a punch-up with Marjorie Halls over Marjorie calling Rosie a word that even the adult Imogen would prefer not to pronounce, but which, sadly, applied to Rosie's lifestyle quite accurately. "Ms. Fox, the headmistress will see you now." The secretary was young and pretty, and judging by the looks she was constantly throwing at her left hand, at the sparkly ring on it, freshly engaged. Imogen, hungry, stressed, and painfully reminded by the surroundings how boring and loveless her life had promised to be when she was a pupil here, and how the life had kept its promise, dragged herself after the secretary. Deidre rose from her seat and walked from around her monumental desk. She shook Imogen's hand and ushered her to a small round table by the wall. Imogen tucked herself on a surprisingly soft chair, pressing her handbag to her chest. The paper bag with the books crunched loudly inside. The Scotsman with impressive legs was clearly getting too chummy with Isabella. "What can I do for you, Imogen?" Mrs. Dyer asked politely. "I have 2 matters to discuss with you, Mrs. Dyer." Imogen started in a raspy voice and cleared her throat. "Firstly, I have something to give to you, and I would like you to know at this stage that I do not judge and do not make any assumptions." Deidre studied her over her glasses, looking suddenly exactly like her brother. "All right," she drew out. "And the second matter? I would like to ask you for a favor, and perhaps I should start with it, in case I'd horribly miscalculated and made a faux pas." Imogen gave out a small, awkward laugh. "Well, let's hear it then," Deidre answered, her eyes cautious. "Mrs. Dyer, I've given a thought to your suggestion for me to have a conversation with your father regarding the bypass, and I can't agree on that, because I'm quite certain that even a private conversation with no disclosure of any official information would be a betrayal of trust towards my work position." Deidre leaned back in the chair and was just going to answer, but a knock at the door, and then the secretary with a tea tray, made them both stay quiet for a few minutes. Once the door closed behind the girl, Deidre took off her glasses and pinched her nose, again exactly in the same gesture as the mayor. I understand, Miss Fox, that your refusal to see my father is an expression of the very loyalty that Tommy admires about you so much. But surely your personal loyalty towards my brother shouldn't stand in the way of what is beneficial for the town." "I realize that," Imogen answered, trying to straighten her spine, her backside sinking into the weirdly soft seat. "That's why I was going to ask you for a favor. I think you should talk to Mr. Oakby and share your father's concerns about the contract with the Americans." "But he wouldn't listen to me. Neither of them does. They only hear themselves," the headmistress scoffed. "Then why do you think they would listen to me?" Imogen exclaimed. "Because Tommy's in love with you and simply can't function without you, while my father asked for you himself. I'm sure you could establish some sort of a communication between the two men." The headmistress made a scornful noise again and started pouring tea. Meanwhile, inside Imogen's head, there was this odd, loud whistling sound, as if a kettle was boiling out on a cooker.